هذا ما أشار له المسؤولون العسكريون.
The United States is in a state of security and surprise.
We fear this. We fear that they have something out that majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı. Ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. You get a lot of killers. Why you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone fixed me up. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Hello, welcome to Varn Blog, and today we're with Sam Kangarloo, who is a anarchist MMT advocate, specialist, whatever you want to call him. And we will be talking about inflation, inflationary pressures, doing a little bit of prediction with upcoming political movements where we're seeing the Democrats go. Biden's most recent State of the Union address indicated a pretty significant rightward shift for the Democrats. And it's going to be interesting how we see all this come out. But first, we need some basics here. So we're going to begin with Sam's understanding of modern monetary theory as spelled out by Warren Mosler, which is one of the older forms of MMT. So we'll start with that, Sam. How would you like to begin today?
All right, let's just go through MMT fundamental insights. I would say that, none of the MMT economists out there would disagree with anything I'm about to go over. The way that it might be conveyed or expressed might be slightly different between various MMTers, but there's nothing in what I'm about to go over that any MMTer would say is inaccurate. The emphasis that I'm going to be using a lot of Bill Mitchell and Warren Mosler's emphasis. There's going to be a lot of Stephanie Kelton emphasis as well in terms of where the focus is on. But I think this will be as good as a 10 to 12 minute crash course in MMT that folks are likely to find. So let's do it. First and foremost, MMT. It's not something that is done. Okay, this is a thoroughly empirical project. So this should also be, as I go through this rundown, be considered as something that is going to dispel a lot of myths about MMT, a lot of disinformation and misinformation, because there is a lot of that out there. We hear everything from you guys just want to, this is just printing money and, we're going to all be shoveling, pushing wheelbarrows down the street in order to pay for things, or you want to monetize the debt is another one that we hear, or, where has this ever worked? It's just one terrible misunderstanding after another in much of the mainstream press. So I hope to set the record straight on a lot of that and clear things up for your audience and for people out there. So first and foremost, modern monetary theory. This is not something you do. This is an observation. It's a thoroughly empirical project. So that means it's descriptive, not prescriptive. And that means that that makes it something that can be grafted onto literally any number of political ideologies and orientations. So from liberalism to conservatism, progressivism to Trumpism, fascism to socialism, and any other one you can think of. Okay. Or to quote preeminent MMT scholar and economist Bill Mitchell, MMT is not a regime that you apply or switch to or introduce. Rather, MMT is a lens which allows us to see the true intrinsic workings of the fiat monetary system. It helps us better understand the choices available to a currency issuing government. It is not a regime, but an accurate perspective on reality. So I prefer You can call it a lens. I like to use the term framework, but either one really. So what are the central insights or revealed truths, okay, that MMT demonstrates to be the case? So here I'm going to do high-level MMT fundamentals, and then over the course of our discussion, we'll go into greater detail on these fundamentals and these insights as they come up. So, and this is in somewhat particular order, but I don't want to say that, it's necessarily, people shouldn't look at this as entirely weighted from that which begins first and that which comes last. These are all part and parcel of what makes up MMT. So money is a creature of some issuing authority. It was not born of barter. It doesn't represent barter, as we've all been raised to think, and that so many economists in the mainstream get wrong. Even Karl Marx got that one wrong. The barter story of money is a complete and utter myth. Okay. This realization about what money actually is and how it functions is known as chartalism and has been corroborated by anthropologists the world over long before MMT came to fruition back in 1996. The most notable anthropologist to corroborate this MMT claim is probably the very recently deceased David Graeber, who in his book Debt, the First 5,000 Years, proves exactly this claim, right? But he's not the first or only anthropologist to have proven this. That being the case, what is money then? So 3 things, and this is what you're not going to get if you are, I don't care if you're at a state university, most state universities somewhere, if you're at an Ivy League college, they're not going to explain to you accurately or really at all, it's kind of the third rail, what money is. They will allude to it being in your economics education at such places, any place that teaches neoclassical, even Keynesian, even post-Keynesian for the most part. They're not going to really touch it. They're going to say, oh, well, it's just sort of lubricates the gears of the economy. It lubricates transactions, but it's this nebulous, ephemeral, sort of intangible thing. But no, MMT gives us the tools we need to understand what it actually is. And it's 3 primary things. So it's a social unit of account, pretty straightforward. It's a promise to pay, an IOU. And then there's a third thing that is definitely not straightforward. And I can build upon this later, but I'm just going to state it for now. And that is that money is a tax credit. So again, I realize that's not self-explanatory, but we will build and delve into that a little bit deeper as we go on. So what then is currency, right? If those 3 things are money, then what is currency? Well, currency is just the state's money. And of course, here we're talking nation state. Currency is just the state's money, right? The state is an issuing authority. And currency is a public monopoly, all right? And it's a public monopoly that we have to keep 5 central things in mind over. Because it's a public monopoly, the funds to pay taxes come from the state, right? So if the currency is a public monopoly, then the funds to pay taxes come from the state. State spending, okay, precedes. And these 5 things, by the way, are straight from Warren Mosler. I want to point that out. I didn't need these things right here I'm giving you, didn't even paraphrase, didn't build from something that I'm pulling in from influences and then creating something original. These are coming straight from Warren Mosler. He provides these when he gives talks and mentions that the currency is a public monopoly. You'll see this on his slide. So state spending precedes the payment of taxes and the purchase of state securities. What are state securities? Those are bonds. So what does that mean in layman's terms, right? It doesn't mean that, as we've all been raised and come to think of how this all works, is that we tax and then spend, okay? We issue bonds and then we spend. No, all right? What the currency being a public monopoly tells us is that the spending comes first. We spend and then we tax. We spend and then there's the purchase of bonds, of state securities. Okay, so the next thing is state spending is limited only by what tax liabilities cause to be offered for sale. I'm going to repeat that because this a lot of this, it's very simple, but it requires a paradigm shift because of what we've all been indoctrinated to think for so long. So state spending is limited only by what tax liabilities cause to be offered for sale. All right. Without the tax liability, there wouldn't be anything offered for sale. There wouldn't be anything offered for sale because the money wouldn't exist, right? So tax liabilities are the cause of unemployment. This is number 4. Tax liabilities are the cause of unemployment. It's the tax liability that drives the currency, that drives the public monopoly. All right. And then the 5th thing is the price level is a function of prices paid by the state when it spends. And what that means is that markets are setting prices based on an absolute price that is set by the issuing authority. In other words, markets can't set a price that is anything other than relative. They require some sort of absolute price setter in order to set a price themselves. So when markets set a price, they're setting a price relative to the price that the monopolist is paying, right? We are all of us in the economy, okay? We are price takers. The government, all right, is a price maker. The government is setting the price of goods and services by way of what it is willing to spend on goods and services, including labor. And we'll get into this a little bit more as we go along. All right. So next fundamental insight, right, is there's this concept of monetary sovereignty. All right. And depending on the level of monetary sovereignty that a nation state has, all right, their financing of federal spending, okay, is not constrained by revenue. In other words, if you are monetarily sovereign fully, under no conditions, if you're fully monetarily sovereign, all right, do taxes finance your nation's spending. So what that means is that government does not actually tax in order to spend, as I mentioned earlier, nor does it actually borrow in order to spend, okay? Meaning bonds do not function to finance government spending. Monetarily sovereign nations spend money into existence, no matter where they are on the spectrum. Okay, if they're fully monetarily sovereign, if they're not, Dr. Fadl Kaboub and Dr. Scott Fulwiler use a 4-point system of gauging or measuring the degree of monetary sovereignty that a nation state has. The United States is fully monetarily sovereign. I'll give some examples as we go along here of other nations and where they're at. But monetarily sovereign nations spend money into existence through their federal legislative bodies. Okay, that means that as issuers of a currency that they have control over, they spend first, and when they tax, those tax dollars are actually deleted from the economy. So your federal tax dollars, and I know this is a bold claim for many of your audience to hear, but functionally speaking, your tax dollars, when they're paid, it's a reserve drain, and that's a technical term that folks aren't going to understand off the bat, but we can get into it. Your tax dollars are deleted from the economy. In a country like the United States that has full monetary sovereignty, your tax dollars do not pay for any federal spending whatsoever. They can't. Like functionally, they can't. We could make them if we went back to a gold standard and didn't have enough gold to support new spending, then sure, you'd either have to go and dig up more gold or tax in order to spend. But since we are not on a fixed exchange system that is tied to a commodity like gold, our federal tax dollars don't actually finance any federal spending. Now, this includes, and I know this will also come as a shock to many, this includes payroll taxes, therefore Medicare and Social Security. And this was well understood by the Roosevelt administration, by the way, when they introduced the Social Security program. And I know all of this begs a lot of questions about okay, What about all this money I hear we owe to the Chinese? But we can cover those kinds of details in depth as we go along. I do think it's important now to define what a monetarily sovereign nation is, okay, or a fully monetarily sovereign nation. A fully monetarily sovereign nation is one that meets 4 criteria. And this is really critical to understand. So if you are fully monetarily sovereign, your country, as the United States is, that means you meet all 4 of these criteria. You issue your own currency. You tax only in your own currency. Therefore, you must not be taxing your population in any currency other than your own, right? You issue liabilities denominated only in your own currency. What do I mean by liabilities? I'm talking about debt. So you're not issuing debt denominated in another currency. So in other words, you're not selling debt in some other nation's currency. You're selling it only in your own. Okay. And the 4th thing is you let your currency float. In other words, the currency isn't pegged to anything like gold or silver or another currency. Now, there are countries, China is a really good example. Actually, before I mention that, let me give some examples of countries that are fully monetarily sovereign out there in the world today. US, as I mentioned, Canada, the UK, Japan, Australia, Sweden, Norway, Switzerland, New Zealand, Iceland, and many others. Now, if you look at, for example, China does have their currency pegged to the US dollar, okay? But they meet the other 3 criteria. China is highly monetarily sovereign. They might not be, quote, fully monetarily sovereign, but they're highly monetarily sovereign, all right? And they have enough dollar reserves, okay? They have enough dollar reserves because of how all of the goods that they sell the United States, they're getting US dollars in exchange for those goods. They have enough dollar reserves that their population, when it's taxed, those federal tax dollars also do not function to finance China's federal spending. Why? Because they always have enough US dollars to back that spending, where the only way that it would be Chinese taxpayer dollars financing Chinese federal spending would be if the Chinese were trying to spend in excess of the dollar reserves that they have. Then they would have to either use dollars that they get from taxing their population to finance that spending, or they could get more dollar reserves by selling more goods and services to us in the United States, or some combination thereof. Okay, and for the more astute among your audience, they'll notice that I didn't mention a single country that is on the euro, and there's a good reason for that. Euroland does not have monetary sovereignty. We can get into that a little bit later. I can also, in 2 steps, tell you how we could, not we or I personally, but how Euroland could easily solve their so-called sovereign debt crisis. It's very straightforward. They probably won't do it, though. We can get into that later. All right. So nothing about what I've said, however, means that the government cannot spend without constraint. There is a constraint, okay? It's just not tax dollars. It's just not bond issuance or so-called debt issuance, all right? The constraint is real resource availability. When the spending in an economy, otherwise known as aggregate demand in econ speak, outstrips the amount of goods and services being produced, and there aren't enough available resources, land, labor, capital, machinery, to meet that increased spending, you get inflationary, or you can get inflationary pressure, which can lead to actual inflation, right? So that's what's known as demand pull inflationary pressure. So too much inflation, you get a general rise in prices that can hamper the value of people's money as prices rise, and purchasing power declines, right? And so that's the demand pull inflation, like intro teaser, okay? There's also cost push inflation and sectoral inflation, which is also known as like monopoly inflation. And we'll launch into those and delve into that deeper as we go along. So everything I mentioned in that insight means that governments do not and should not function like households. Okay, you and I have to balance our budget, or we have to borrow. That is not the case for governments, nor should it be. Okay, nor should it be. Now, why? Because otherwise they create pressure for an otherwise unnecessary economic crisis if they treat themselves like a household. And I'll explain why over the course of our discussion. So third fundamental or fourth fundamental insight of MMT is sectoral balances. By virtue of the public sector spending money into existence, right, and therefore into the economy, then the government's yearly budget deficits are the economy's yearly surpluses. And the government's national debt, which by definition is the sum total of all budget deficits and surpluses that government has ever run. And by the way, that's not controversial, like every school of econ would agree. That is the national savings of the private sector. So what we have come to think of as the quote national debt is only debt by virtue of the fact that all money in and of itself is debt. But it's literally the national savings of the private sector. It's not debt at all, at least not in the way that you and I as households have debt. And so to quote pay it off would literally mean that there would not be a single red cent in the economy. All right. And that's another point that anthropologists, including David Graeber, who I mentioned earlier, have recognized as a result of research in their own discipline. And it's totally congruent with MMT. The government sector's account balance equals the sum of the non-government sector, namely the private sector and foreign sector to the penny. So I'm gonna make this concrete with an example. The United States has a so-called national debt. I mean, it's over this number now, but like last I checked, it was like roughly $20 trillion. That $20 trillion, that's the government that's all the money that the government of the United States has spent into existence since 1786. Okay, so that is the net between all budget deficits and surpluses that the United States has run since 1786. It's the cumulative sum of all the budget deficits and surpluses the U.S. has run since 1786. That is a fact. And then when you examine how many dollars are held in the domestic private economy, households and firms, you see that it's roughly like, I don't know, last I checked, it was like 8 trillion or something. Or like 19 point, whatever it was. And then like the remaining amount is the number of dollars held by foreign entities. And that's our current account deficit. Okay. That is the money, the so-called money that we owe the Chinese. We'll get into that. So right now, dollars held by foreigners is somewhere in the total, like in the range of, I think it's 200, let me see, current account deficits. Yeah, it's like 215 billion. Okay, so you take that 20 trillion number and you subtract by 215 billion. And when you add up what's in our economy plus what foreigners hold, those two figures summed together equal that $20 trillion of so-called debt that we've spent into existence over the entire lifespan of the country. Okay, so if you were to pay off the debt, if you were to get rid of all of the money that is represented but through vis-a-vis bonds in the private sector and through what's held by foreign entities, there's no dollars left. Like there's just no dollars. There's no dollars abroad and there's no dollars in the economy. Okay, the only place you could then have dollars where they would exist in the economy would be dollars that banks create, which we're going to get into because it's a different form of money. All right. So these are nothing more. What I've just gone over, that's nothing more than empirically true accounting identities. So there's certain professions that pick up on what we're getting at very, very quickly, just by the nature of their work, certified public accountants being one of them. And central banks, like the Federal Reserve, they're just scorekeepers. The Federal Reserve doesn't have dollars. It doesn't not have them. Or, central banks of other countries, they don't have pounds or yen. They don't not have them. The money is created out of thin air by legislative decree. And that's what is meant when you hear the term fiat currency. The central bank's job in that respect is simply to type those dollars, yen, pounds, whatever, into existence, which is how it happens, by the way, okay? Is they are doing what the legislative bodies tell them to do when it comes to the money supply, all right? It is the fiscal authority that has control of the money supply, not the monetary authority, not the central bank. All right, we'll get into that a little bit later. So, sixth central insight, banking. The common perception is that deposits create loans, right? You go to the bank and the bank is lending out your deposits. Like it's just comically wrong. So loans actually create deposits, all right? Deposits don't create loans. Again, counterintuitive. But private banks, like the ones where we all keep our money, they create money out of thin air when they lend, all right? And that's what's known as bank money. It's also referred to, synonymous term, as credit money, all right? So they keystroke those dollars into existence as well. So you have the dollars that the Federal Reserve is keystroking into existence as a result of federal spending, government spending, legislative decree, what in the United States are called appropriations bills, all right? So the Treasury is directing the Federal Reserve to mark up whatever corresponding relevant accounts are to be marked up as a result of legislation, as a result of law that requires new spending. Again, those are appropriations bills in the US, that's what they're called. Okay. When you take a loan out at your bank is just keystroking what's called bank money or credit money into existence. So remember, I said there's 20 trillion, right? Dollars, so-called debt. That's all what's known as high-powered currency. That is the money that, as a result of legislative decree, that's the fiat currency that has been spent into existence. All right. Now there's even more than 20 trillion in credit money in the economy, okay? But that doesn't change the net assets of the economy. When the government spends money into existence, it is it's altering the net assets of the private sector. But when a bank does it, it's not changing the net assets of the private sector. Why? Because what's happening on both sides of the ledger, okay? So Mr. Varn's account here has just gone up for the amount of the loan that he took out, all right? But on the other side of the book, on the bank side of the book, all right, is that liability. And so you go out into the economy, you get that money, and now you have just zeroed out that loan that you owe. There's been no change whatsoever to the assets in the private sector. When anybody gets a loan, that's new money that's being created, but it's also creating a debit on the other side of the bank's ledger, okay? And so that money is, in and of itself, by definition, money that is not changing the net assets of the economy at all. And it's very dangerous, by the way, to run an economy that has to rely on credit. If there isn't enough money for us to all be competing for, then relying on loans means that somebody's going to be left holding the bag. And this, at some place, at some sector, in some area of the economy, what you tend to see happen in those situations is a credit bubble. And it's actually what happened under the Clinton years with the budget surplus. We'll talk more about that and how it led to the dot-com bust, and my concerns and MMT's concerns for how we could be ramping up right now for a similar fall by running the budget surpluses that we're currently running under Joe Biden as of this year. It sounds not good, but it's a potential disaster waiting to happen unless they reverse course. So that's a little bit on the banking side. Unemployment, all right? Seventh thing, unemployment is never an economic inevitability. It's always a political choice. I know that's going to rub a lot of Marxists the wrong way, but I think I can make a very strong case for why that's true. So the government can buy as much labor as it wants. And, we talk about MMT being descriptive and not prescriptive, but that there are obvious policy options that bracket out of, or possibilities, depending on one's politics, that bracket out of these insights. And the one that you'll hear most discussed by MMTers is a federal jobs guarantee. Okay, because as you'll often hear us say, unemployment is evidence of a deficit that's too small, of a budget deficit that's too small. And MMT notices that a federal jobs guarantee can simultaneously solve the problem of unemployment while maintaining price stability, therefore avoiding inflation, which is, by the way, what every central bank claims their charge is. And that may be their charge. It may be the thing that the executive branch turns to them for, but they don't have the tools for it. It's anemic. What's available for them to try and tackle unemployment and price stability, therefore monetary policy, doesn't work. And so the federal jobs guarantee is a counter-cyclical economic option, which just means that it contracts and expands with the business cycle. And I'm happy to chat more about that later on as well. But taking all of that into account, so whenever you hear someone, it doesn't matter who it is, could be a policymaker, a friend, whoever, they ask how you're going to pay for that when it comes to some policy that, for the broader left would like to see enacted, whether that's single payer healthcare, Green New Deal, living wage, federal jobs guarantee, or for people on the other side of the political spectrum, it might be tax cuts. And I think actually we'll talk about this, I'm sure, later on, but I could make a left case for tax cuts under an MMT framework too. Question is who gets them, right? And who are they targeted towards? But, whenever that question about how are you going to pay for it comes up, my answer is literally the same way we've always been paying for all government spending. Since FDR took us off the domestic gold standard in 1934. Congress passes legislation, and then the Treasury spends that money by instructing the Federal Reserve to mark up the relevant bank accounts. The money is simply always spent into existence. And as long as there's enough goods and services being produced or able to be produced, that's the question of resource capacity. Do you have enough land, labor, and capital available to meet the increase or that rise in aggregate demand that may result from your increased spending? So as long as there's enough of those goods and services being produced or able to be produced to meet whatever increased demand those new federally injected dollars might generate, then we can afford it.
Okay, so we've gone through most of the basics. In fact, we went through more today than we even did in our debate a year and a half ago. The one thing I want to pull apart, because we're going to focus on what seems to be for the Democrats the immediate crisis, and the causes. We talked about inflation, and you went through MMT's theory of it. Let's talk about the precise definition of inflation.
Yeah.
The three accepted kinds of inflation, and then what the neoclassical or monetarist theory was for the manipulation of interest rates, because we all know that the Fed is signaling, and not just the Fed, actually, the Japanese central bank, the European central banks, but the Fed is so far committing to this still, that we will see small, very small, but actual increases to the prime bank lending rate for the first time in about a decade. So
Yeah.
let's talk about inflation. So what is the general definition? What are the accepted kinds? And we'll go from
Yes, sure. So inflation is a continuous rise in the price level. Okay, that's the definition of inflation. You get a continuous rise in the price level. That is inflation. So for inflation to stop does not mean prices come down. It means that they stop rising. So when prices stop rising, then you no longer have inflation. And so it's a general or continuous rise in the price level. And the key thing is over an observed period of time. Okay, so over an observed period of time, you see a general rise in prices. That's inflation during that period. So right now we hear that number over and over again, 7.9%. That's over the last year. That's the observed period of time over which we are seeing that has been the last year. Now, where did it come from? How did it get started? What can be done? What can be done about it? So let's look at the three types of inflation first, and then we'll be able to connect this over what happened coming out of COVID to give us this inflation. So the first one I want to tackle is demand pull. I mentioned this in my crash course a little bit that we just did, but to revisit it briefly, people think of, and the monetarists think this way, and there's a lot of neoclassical economists that think in these terms. The post-Keynesians are better on it, but even a lot of Keynesians still think, unfortunately, too much or too close to these terms, is that the quantity of money determines that how much inflation there will be in the system. Okay, this is ridiculous. It's not about how much money exists in the economy. It's about how much spending is occurring relative to available resources. So demand pull inflationary pressure comes from when you have spending outstripping, okay, that which is being produced, productive output, and you don't have the excess capacity, which is also known as slack, okay, available to absorb the additional spending. I know that this is good. Some people are gonna be like, what? So let's make this really simple, okay, by taking an example. All right. There's new spending in the economy, okay? We need lots of widgets, okay? We need lots and lots of widgets, and there aren't enough widgets being produced to meet the amount of widgets that are desired by those who are spending in the economy. And widgets make up a major part of the economy. So that now we've got some inflationary pressure, right? Okay, question, can we produce more widgets to meet that increase in demand? All right, if we have unemployed persons in the economy, that means we have excess capacity, otherwise known as slack in slack in the labor market. Okay, so there's slack because we have a capacity of this, let's say, right? Here's our capacity for employment, but we're only using this much. Okay, and all of these people want widgets, but the amount of people who are employed who are producing them can't produce enough, right, to meet that demand. All right, so no problem. There's all these unemployed people. Here we go. We're going to use that excess capacity to make more widgets. All right, potential crisis averted. There was inflationary pressure, but there was never any actual inflation because we had excess capacity. So there's three factors of production. There's land, labor, there's capital. That was an example using labor. Sometimes it's going to be overwhelmingly a matter of one of those factors of production for which there needs to be excess capacity to meet that increased aggregate demand so that you can have more output. In other cases, it's going to be related to land, which could be zoning for commercial use or other purposes. And then capital in the machinery sense, or now it gets tricky when you talk about like idle investment capital. But even if we treat idle investment capital as part of the capital factor of production, it still functions, whether it's capital machinery or capital machinery and idle potential investment capital. Okay. Do we have idle machinery that could be put to use, or could we increase efficiency in capital machinery to meet the increase in demand? If we can, okay, if we have that technological capacity, or we have the idle machinery that could then be utilized to create more widgets, since we have a rise in the demand for widgets, then we have met that inflationary pressure through increased output and averted being faced with actual inflation. So what that suggests right there is that inflation is just not that easy to generate, contrary to what we've come to worry about. Next form of inflationary pressure is cost push. So what's cost push? It's supply side shocks. Okay, it's all kinds of things that you need to make stuff, all of a sudden there's a shortage of, right? The most obvious one that we all are familiar with, of course, in this day and age that we're unfortunately still so reliant on is oil, all right? If all of a sudden there was a shock to the supply of oil in the world due to war or what have you, then we would see inflationary pressure come from the supply side. Now we saw a lot of different supply side shocks during COVID and coming out of COVID. One of the reasons for this that people really aren't familiar with, it doesn't get a lot of ink, is just-in-time manufacturing applying that kind of pressure. What happened prior to COVID is a lot of firms were switching to just-in-time manufacturing, which is very efficient. It's like, okay, we want to get the product out just as the demand or order comes in, or just anticipate it just ahead instead of so far ahead that we have all of this stock, right? We don't have to warehouse a bunch of product. Instead, as we're anticipating, and a lot of this is, we're using big data these days to anticipate, what's coming in, how many orders we can expect over what quarter, and then firms are going ahead and like, all right, now we'll start to produce that thing in anticipation of that demand, but just in time, not so far ahead and not lagging behind. Now that's great. That's like, way to use high tech. Cool. But then what happens is if you are in a shutdown and you come off that shutdown, and this is the analogy that I use, okay? Like, what's the story every Black Friday, right? It's like everybody's camped out outside of the Best Buy or whatever, waiting for whatever thing. And then the door opens, and what happens? Everybody just rushes right through, right? There's a mad dash for the goods and services. Well, that's what happened. That's what happened with COVID on the demand side, is that during that period, everybody was like pressed up against the door. Then the economy opens, and it's like, and they all come flooding through at once, but the goods aren't there. Why? Because just-in-time manufacturing. There wasn't a lot of stuff being stocked. Right? There wasn't a lot of stuff sitting there. And the things that did need to get to where they needed to go were sitting in the stuff that was available, that was stocked, because of all kinds of supply chain issues, all right, where we had travel restrictions and bans and everything else that made it very difficult for things to get to where they needed to get once that demand pushed through. So the demand comes through, and it's like, okay, for me to get this item, it needed to be in a dockyard, in a port in Los Angeles. Instead, it's still sitting in Greece or wherever. Okay, and so that's part of the effects of living through a pandemic, and we have to take that into account. So that's supply and demand side issues. Now, what about sectoral inflation? and monopoly pressure inflation. So whenever you have a monopolist, they're the price setter. We, the economy here, consumers, we are price takers. Monopolist is a price maker. So if you have a situation, for example, like, if Amazon wanted to gouge us, they don't exactly have a lot of competition. They could do that. And then, what's the recourse? The recourse is the government would have to step in on the consumer's behalf. Now, as far as sectoral inflation goes, if you have, in the United States, our two big ones are healthcare and education. If you have a very very gluttonous sector that's highly inefficient and takes in a lot of inputs, but its outputs are just terrible, relatively speaking. Okay. The healthcare industry is a good example in the United States. It's extremely expensive. It's more expensive than anywhere else in the world per capita. The cost of healthcare in the United States is insane. And the outputs that we get for that spending, relatively speaking, are not good. We have some of the worst healthcare outcomes. And a lot of this has to do with administrative bloat in the United States. And also price gouging, relationships between hospitals and insurance companies, where they have deals based on what can be charged, what the insurance company is willing to pay for. What's his name? Do you know this show on? He had a really good segment. I forget the guy's. It's like something ruins everything. You know who I'm talking about? Like Adam ruins everything.
Oh, Adam. Adam ruins everything. Yeah.
Yeah. Is it Adam? Yeah. So Adam Ruins Everything had a really great one on what's called, I think, the charge master at hospitals, and how a relationship going back, many, many decades now, really like mid-late 70s, between insurance companies and hospital networks allowed them to create this monopoly pricing. So, and then of course, education, I don't need to tell you, you have this academic background, that we're living in a world now, especially in the US, since that's what we're giving examples for sectoral inflationary pressure.
But also in Europe.
Is it? Yeah, I was going to say, like, the admin to instructor gap in the US now is like 12-1, 14-1 at Ivy League schools. It's terrible. That kind of like wasteful spending, when you have a sector of the economy that makes up such a large portion of GDP, like our healthcare system in the United States makes up a large portion of GDP. Our education sector in the United States, higher education, makes up a significant portion of GDP. That's a lot of spending that goes into that, and the outcomes, what comes out of it is relatively inefficient. So, hiring that many admins to professors will create some bottlenecks in spending. And so that's sectoral inflationary pressure. And so what can be done about that? Really, you're just looking at regulation. You're going to have to change public mission in order to alleviate and ameliorate those kind of pressures. In the case of healthcare, I just want to touch real quick on, progressives in this country, liberals, conservatives, like anybody who supports single payer healthcare. The thinking is always that, okay, we'll just siphon off some money from military spending. We'll tax the rich to pay for it. Okay, so here's the thing: is not only would you not need to raise taxes to pay for single payer healthcare, you'd actually have to lower taxes to, quote, pay for single payer healthcare. Now, why is that? Because as I just mentioned, our current healthcare system is incredibly bloated. The inputs far outweigh the outputs. It's inefficient, it's gluttonous, it's pork, it's got bottlenecks. And if you were to switch to a single payer system, what you're doing is you're releasing a lot of resources. You're getting rid of that bloat. To run a single payer system, you wouldn't need anywhere as near as many employees to manage and run and operate and make that system functioning as you do our current for-profit healthcare system. So with those folks now unemployed, okay, that's a loss of aggregate demand. Like, they're losing a paycheck, right? All of the spending including zoning of buildings, infrastructure spending, like all of the office space, all of the machinery, all of the tools, all of them, really computers, anything sort of white collar desk job that goes into that system is now a quote in econ terms, a released resource, right? It's going idle. It's no longer being used. Okay. And if it's no longer being used, that's deflationary pressure. That all of that demand is now gone. Those inputs are no longer there. So that creates deflationary pressure. And you have two ways of dealing with that. And again, this is assuming all other spending is equal, right? Okay, if all other spending is equal and you switch to a single payer system, you can now either to compensate for that deflationary pressure, you can either spend more money somewhere else in the economy, right? Or you could cut taxes or some combination of the two, something to offset the deflationary pressure of releasing all of those real resources in land, labor, and capital from the elimination of the wasteful private healthcare spending system. So again, it's like there are plenty of good reasons from a like progressive political orientation to tax the rich. To pay for stuff is not one of them because it literally doesn't. Like I can't take Jeff Bezos's money and use it to spend for something else. It's just not how it works. This is not how the Treasury and the Federal Reserve coordinate their operations. We don't wait for tax receipts before we spend or otherwise issue the bond in order to meet the obligation. We always spend the money into existence first. And this begs the question, well, then why the bonds, right? And then this is also takes us to the question of what about all this money I hear we owe the Chinese? So by rule, this is a spillover from the gold standard. We have to have dollar matching bonds for every dollar spent into existence. So most of these bonds, and people don't understand this, are, by the way, purchased by the Federal Reserve itself. Like overwhelming number of the bond purchases are purchased by the central bank. Okay. And so the federal government spends, the Treasury issues the bonds, Federal Reserve sells some of the bonds to like Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, all these other big banks who have parked cash and would prefer to earn some interest on this parked cash, right? Or commercial banks, member banks who have excess reserves and would now rather, instead of having that money remain idle, earn some rate of interest on them. So they purchase these bonds. And the bonds don't finance the spending. And literally what's happening here is money moving from a checking account to a savings account. So the bank, the money that, say, JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs has, or a Federal Reserve member bank, your commercial bank has at the Federal Reserve in a reserve account is just a checking account. That's just fancy econ speak, a reserve account for a checking account. A securities account is literally a savings account at the Federal Reserve. Okay, so we have this rule that says that the Treasury's general account, TGA, cannot go negative. It can't go negative. So that when the Treasury spends, their balance cannot have a negative, have a minus sign in front of it. So how do we keep that from happening? We keep it from happening by issuing a bond. So now a bond is issued, the Treasury's account can't go negative. Okay, because we've issued the bond, it's not negative. Great. All right. But here's the thing is it's just an asset swap. So when the Federal Reserve sells a Treasury and somebody buys that Treasury, AKA a bond, okay, money is just moving from that entity's checking account at the Federal Reserve into now what is their securities account, which is just a savings account. Okay, so how do you, when you go to redeem that bond, what do? It's no problem. You just move the money that's in the savings account, the securities account, back over to the checking account. So why do they do this? If what I'm saying is true, if what MMT is saying is true, then what the hell is the function? What is the purpose? Right? That's the next question. And the purpose is very straightforward. It's so that the Federal Reserve can hit its policy rate. So people generally tend to think that if the Federal Reserve hikes rates, as we're hearing about quite often in the news now, okay, Fed is going to raise rates. Okay, it doesn't just say it and then it's so. It has to buy and sell bonds to hit that rate. It has to buy and sell bonds to hit that rate. Now, why? Because the natural rate of interest is zero. Well, what does that mean? What does that mean? What does it mean that the natural rate of interest is zero? University of Missouri, Kansas City, which is really where modern monetary theory got pioneered. Okay, there was a they ran experiments on this right within their the university as evidence, like very simple. There's just simple ways to sort of prove this. Okay, because remember what I said earlier. I said the tax liability is what drives the currency. Okay, the tax liability drives the currency. And how is that tied to the claim that the natural rate of interest is zero? Well, okay, let's think of it in these terms. All right, so, and I'll use actually UMKC a case. So there was a community service program running the econ department at UMKC, and the students were, taxed in the department's own currency. All right, so the department created a currency, and in order to pay this tax, this debt, you had to perform community service to obtain the units of that currency. Okay, so right there, that is analogous with what every single nation state does in order to provision itself, because we expect the government to provide roads, bridges, et cetera, right? And in order for the government to be considered legitimate in the citizenry's eyes, right, it has to do the things that the citizenry expects of it. Okay, and the only way for the government to do that is to get people to work for it. All right. Before there can be a private sector by which we can spend the currency, there has to be some sort of state-driven provisioning of the government itself. Okay, so the government literally creates unemployment. It can't come from anywhere else. Okay, unemployment is created as soon as a tax liability exists from an issuing authority. So when the government says, okay, I'm going to issue a tax, what it's saying to you and me is, oh, okay, I have to pay this tax. What do I have to pay it in? And if it's the Republic of Varn, you say, Santa, you got to pay this tax liability in Varns. And I say, oh, okay, how do I get Varns? And you say, go dig a ditch. So I go dig a ditch, and now I have the Varns to pay you. What have you done effectively? You've just created unemployment. So getting back to the UMKC situation, students were taxed in the department's own currency. They had to perform community service to obtain the units of that currency. And the department's, quote, treasury could offer interest-earning bonds purchased by the students who had excess units of the currency. Well, how did they get the excess units of currency? Well, they did more work than was required to pay the tax, right? Okay, but the rate of interest offered is entirely up to the discretion of the departmental treasury. If the treasury in this experiment said, okay, 3%, then it's 3%. You issue the bonds for 3%. If the treasury did not offer interest earning bonds, then the base rate on the currency would be zero. It would have to be zero. There's no other choice. Okay, it doesn't, by point of logic, it would have to be zero. The natural base rate, and I'm quoting Randall Wray here, is zero on hoards created through deficit spending, unless the Treasury chooses to intervene to maintain a positive base rate. So deficits necessarily imply a zero base rate. To have excess of something and not offer a rate of return on that excess means a zero base rate. Okay, so the government is setting the interest rate, and then it has to hit that rate. And the only way it can do it is by selling and buying bonds. So now this gets us into, okay, QE. This gets us into, oh my God, tapering. I hear the Fed is tapering. What is there's like none of this is cause for concern. It's just the Fed hitting its target rate. So recently there was a lot of news about, oh, the Fed is tapering. First of all, what that means is they're not buying back as many bonds. Okay, and they're going to slow down the number of bond purchases that they make. Why would they do that? Because they're afraid that the rate of interest will fall below the rate that they've set. Okay, if another way to think of this is if the Federal Reserve is doing, okay, quantitative easing is another one that people freak out about all the time. All right. The only thing that's happening there is that the Federal Reserve is coming in and saying, here, we're going to give you money for those bonds. We're going to, oh, the maturity date is on such and such month and year. Oh, we'll pay you for them now with all of the interest paid. Like, okay, you're a bondholder. Great. I don't have to wait for my money. Here, take it. All right. So bonds need to be thought of as cash that just pays interest. They're just cash that pays interest. It's interest-bearing cash. That's all it is. It's one super liquid asset, which is cash, for one near super liquid asset, which is the bond. And all of these things are just moving back and forth between the accounts. Now, does the Federal Reserve realize this? The Federal Reserve knows that they don't control the money supply. The Federal Reserve hasn't even considered monetarism as the way it operates in decades. They know that's not what's happening functionally. But they do still think that the interest rate setting, which only can come from the buying and selling of bonds, okay, the quantity and what's known as the coupon rate, the rate at which they're issued, okay, as setting the interest rate, all right? And so when you're afraid that the rate is going to fall below your target rate, what do? You sell more of the bonds, okay? When you're afraid that the rate is going to rise above the rate that you've set, okay, what do? You buy more of the bonds. Now, why? Like, how does that make any sense? Okay, all right, it looks like the interest rate is going to rise up. I'm the central bank chairman, I'm Powell, and it looks like because of market forces, and by market forces, I mean in the bond market in this case, it looks like, all right, the interest rate is going to go above the rate that I have set, okay? It's going to go higher than the rate that I want. How do I offset that? Okay, I buy back the bonds. I give cash for the bonds, okay? Because another way to think of it is that if everyone is a seller, and this is Mosler points this out, if everyone is a seller of reserves and nobody's a buyer of reserves, meaning banks who have to buy and sell to each other on the inter-exchange banking market to meet the reserve requirements when there is a reserve requirement, or to have enough money on hand to meet cash withdrawals and to meet interbank transactions, settlements, okay? If everyone's a seller of reserves and no one's a buyer of reserves, it drives the interest rate down to zero, okay? So the only thing that the bonds can do is to function for the Federal Reserve to hit its interest rate. And the Federal Reserve knows this. Like when they're doing QE, they know that's what they're doing. They're trying to hit the interest rate target. But where they have it absolutely wrong is they still think that the interest rate itself, in other words, the target rate that they set, is going to have some impact on inflation, which it doesn't.
Okay. So with the Fed raising interest rates and cutting back QE, and the European and Japanese central banks have indicated they will do the same, we know that there does seem to be some dissonance between, say, what Yellen is saying, what Powell is doing, because the interest rate raises are so low. And we know that a lot of the inflation we're seeing right now is demand shock. So what is the purpose? What seems to be the purpose of raising the interest rates at the Fed right now? What are they? What is the policy goal there? And then we'll come back to QE because I have some questions for you about that.
Absolutely. Okay. So first of all, the conventional wisdom, the mainstream econ view, neoclassical, Keynesian, even to some degree post-Keynesian, is that by raising rates, okay, you are going to mitigate inflation and inflationary pressure. You'll be able to stop inflation by raising rates. Now, why do they think that? They think that because, okay, you will not be compelled, you will be dissuaded from, okay, borrowing. That is the thinking, that, okay, if you raise interest rates, all right, people will stop borrowing and that'll calm the economy down. There'll be less aggregate demand. Now, here's the problem with that, okay? Two things. One, earlier I said, you know, they're changing the interest rate has no effect on inflation. It has one potential way, but it's exactly the opposite from what it is they think it does, or the way in which they think it does. So the way they think it works is, as you alluded to, that they will raise interest rates and that will calm inflationary pressure, that will mitigate inflation. All right, so here's the thing, is you and I, whether or not they raise rates, okay, if they, let's say they raise rates, am I gonna go, okay, great? Are most working people going to go, great, I'll just stop spending. This is no problem. Like, I don't have to buy as many groceries now. I don't have to pay as much on rent now, right? I don't need as many basics anymore because they raised interest rates. Instead, I'm going to use that money that I would have spent and now save it. I'm going to go stick it in my savings account at my bank. I'm not going to spend as much of it because thank goodness they raised rates. No, you know who does that? Super rich people. And because they already have so much money, what it does is it opens an interest income channel. So if you raise interest rates, people who are already rich have now more money to spend. So if anything, there is actually inflationary pressure generated by raising interest rates. During an inflationary period, that's a recipe for making the situation worse. Okay, but the logic behind it, that, okay, by raising rates, people will just stop spending as much and we're incentivizing savings, doesn't work, because the vast majority of people aren't going to change their spending habits as a result of the fact that their bank is now going to give them a higher rate of return on their savings. They still have to spend to the same amounts, the same degree, the same rate to meet their regular expenses. They just don't have as much expendable money as the people at the very top. And the ones who do, that's simply basic income. It becomes a universal basic income for the wealthy. That's what raising interest rates does, which, if anything, and I'm telling you that the effect on inflation by raising rates is mostly anemic, but if you get it high enough, I can show you inflationary pressure as a result, because there will be plenty of, the purchase of like luxury goods and items going up en masse across a large enough swath of the population. If it gets high enough and you have like the top 10% of the income distribution or the wealth income distribution curve saving more, okay, or having more of that excess cash and then going out and spending it on more luxury goods, okay, it can actually be inflationary, which is exactly the opposite of what the Fed is trying to do by raising rates. By raising rates, they're trying to keep prices from going up. And instead, it offers the possibility, if they raise the rate high enough, of opening up the income interest channel increasing aggregate demand among the top 10%. And if they decide they want to spend seriously, then it can have an impact in exactly the opposite direction by raising prices even further. It's otherwise anemic and no discernible change in the price level.
So can we talk about a couple of empirical examples of this? I mean, one of the interesting things is the infamous Volcker shock and then the subsequent inflation and lack of it in the both in the 70s and the 80s. So can you talk about the way that like Carter and Volcker explain that versus
absolutely.
the way MMT would explain that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the conventional wisdom was that, we had this inflationary crisis in the U.S. And this was entirely the result of the hothouse economy. Kalecki talks about this, and unions were so strong and were able to the demand as a result of wages rising was so great, and workers had free reign, so much free reign over which employer they were going to go to, because we had a near full employment economy. And so employees could simply bid themselves out to the highest employer. Okay. So that wages were being bid up because you had a full employment economy. It's created a hothouse economy. Most of the capital remained domestic relative to where we are now, or which much greater, relatively speaking, foreign holdings of capital. And so this hothouse economy led to this horrible inflationary situation. Now, did that story contribute? Yes. But what was the thing that broke the back of the inflationary threshold, so to speak, was the OPEC oil crisis, right? So the oil shortages, and oil, of course, is used to develop many finished goods as a raw material that goes into the manufacture of so many things. If you have an oil shock, okay, that's going to affect the price of everything, all right, almost. So because of the shortage of oil, plus to some extent this hothouse economy scenario where labor was very strong, and again, unions were very strong, especially relative to where they are now. Bargaining power was very strong. You had that aggregate demand side, okay, plus now the oil shock. So there's your cost. So you had the demand pull side, and now with the oil, you have the cost push side of inflationary pressure. Those two things together, you have runaway inflation during that period, mid to late 70s. And then Volcker comes in, a Federal Reserve chairman. He was there. He was 79 to 87, I think. And so he's there, and he raises rates like crazy. 3, 4, 5, 7, 9, 10, 12%. And what happened is by the time the very early 80s come around, the inflation's disappeared. So everybody's toasting to Paul Volcker. Oh, it must have been him raising rates that saved the economy. Nothing could be further from the truth. Volcker's raising rates actually delayed the resolution of the inflationary crisis. How? Okay. And what ultimately got the inflation to subside, all right, was that Jimmy Carter, at the same time, this is a classic for the scientists out, there's a classic case of correlation does not equal causation, and misappropriating causality, okay? When you have concurrent variables. And what happened was Jimmy Carter deregulated natural gas at the same time that Paul Volcker was raising rates through the roof. And so, Warren Mosler likes to tell it that Volcker and Carter still think it was Volcker raising rates through the roof that finally stopped the inflation, when in fact the reality was that Jimmy Carter deregulating natural gas opened up a new channel for energy use, especially for home heating. That's a big one, and that's what brought prices down. Is you now had natural gas being able to compete with oil as an energy source, and that's what did it. And you see it. It's amazing. Like the distribution and the timing is the natural gas hits the market, prices start to come down, and then you see Volcker start to lower the interest rate after the fact, but it's misappropriated for as him having raised them. That was the causality, and nothing could be further from the truth.
So this leads us to the current political situation. We're going to have a lot more supply shock now, not from COVID, but from war. Grains lying fallow in Ukraine, not being exported from Russia, are being exported solely to China.
Yeah,
you have you're going to have a lot of restructuring of supply lines and supply chains, which we were already beginning to do, but this accelerates the need for it. You have people who are arguing that we're going to need to renationalize a whole lot of industry, which I hate to tell people will take a long time, even if we do it. We have all that on the horizon, but we already know from Biden's State of the Address and from the way that they're gearing up that the Democrats hope to run like they did in 2000 on a budget surplus, which again also there's so much misunderstanding of that, because it's always pitched as if a budget surplus is a balanced budget, which it is not. If we had a balanced budget, the economy would effectively not exist. But let's take a minute and look at that for a second, and then let's talk about also as we look at that, maybe how, even though right wingers talk in neoclassical terms, that they have actually been honestly more likely to implement policies that assume MMT conditions.
That's right.
Than Democrats have historically.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so just one correction on the balanced budget piece. So the economy would still exist. It's just that currency issued, is being matched by tax dollars deleted, so that what's being spent you're deleting from the economy an equal number of sovereign currency, US dollars that were not created as bank money, as loan money, as you are removing them from the economy. So what that means is that the net change, when you're running a balanced budget, the net change to the private economy, that $20 trillion number I gave earlier, that just stays 20 trillion. Okay. So if I'm running a budget surplus, what that means is for the year, I'm adding to that 20 trillion. Okay. There's going to be a net injection of money into the economy. If I'm running a budget surplus, there is a net reduction of the number of dollars in the economy. This is really important for people to understand. It's especially if you're out there and you're in somebody who is a reform capitalist or anti-capitalist, as I am, you have to keep in mind that we are all at any given moment in space time all competing for a fixed amount of money that in that moment exists in the economy. Right now, as we're having this conversation, there is a certain amount of sovereign currency issued by the federal government of the United States in the private sector, plus all of the bank money or credit money that was issued. And we are competing for all of that. But the bank money nets to zero. Why? Because it's a loan. Okay. And so the deposit, the loan created the deposit. That nets to zero. Okay. It's on the bank's books as a liability. Their asset is the promissory note, the legal obligation you have to pay them back. The loan sits in your account as an asset. What's the liability on your side? It's the promissory note. So the bank's liability is your asset on the loan transaction, okay? And it's entirely vice versa. So the bank's liability is your asset is the bank's liability. Your liability is the bank's asset is your liability. It's an accounting identity. All right, it's double entry accounting. That's all it is. And so that's not changing the net money supply. The only thing that can change the net money supply is the government spending money into existence. Okay, because the money that the government spends, yes, there might be a matching bond there. Okay, but that matching bond is just a matter of something that is an asset swap. When they issue that bond, there's never a situation where, oh my God, they can't meet that liability and my children are going to we're leaving this debt to my grandkids. Like, that's never the case. That is, it's never the case, because the currency issuer has a monopoly on the money, and you can't owe money to yourself. That's not possible. That's another way to think of it, by the way, that tends to help people, is I can't owe money to myself. The government can't owe money to itself. And if it just stopped issuing these bonds tomorrow, nothing would happen. It would just, the Treasury's account would go negative. The bond issuance isn't necessary to the spending, and the spending could continue. So as far as getting back to the original question, though, is, so when you're running a budget surplus, what ends up happening is that people are now forced to dip into savings, because the national debt is coming down, which means that money that we're all competing for is reduced. It's reduced. Okay, so something has to make up for if aggregate demand stays the same. Look, you and I want to buy the same stuff, right? But now there's less money in the economy for us to buy that same amount of stuff that we've been buying, right? That we've been wanting to buy. Our demand, let's, for the sake of this argument, hasn't changed. We still need the same things. We're still placing the same pressure on output as we have been, but now there's less money for us to do it with, because we've reduced the national debt. Well, what is that inevitably going to lead to? An expansion of credit money. If I still want to buy the same crap, but there's less money being issued to do it with, there's less money for me to be able to get a hold of. Okay, I've got to dip into savings and borrow. That's it. That's the alternative. There is no alternative. Okay, that's the real Tina right there. There is no alternative. Really is, in the situation where you're running a budget surplus. Now the economy is running a deficit. It's running a deficit. Okay, when the government is running a surplus, okay, we're all running a deficit. We're forced to dip into savings or borrow. When the government is running a deficit, the private sector is running a surplus. Okay, our savings in the economy, the amount of money that exists in the economy, goes up as the government's spending goes up. As the government is running a deficit, okay, so here's their deficit. The private economy has more money to spend and compete over. So what does this mean for the Democrats and for inflation? It means we're doomed, potentially in deep shit. Here's why. Okay, so they're going to create a potential credit bubble. The larger this surplus gets, the more people are going to have to dip into savings. That's going to cause the economy to contract. And it's also going to place pressure on unemployment. Okay, the bigger the surplus they run, the more likely we are to run into unemployment going up. Okay, and right now, I mean, there's still a little bit of slack in the labor market, so there's still some unemployed individuals. But as they continue to run a surplus, it's going to put pressure on the labor market. All right, there's going to be less aggregate demand in the system as a result of their reduced spending. This is a disaster waiting to happen. What'll happen is the Democrats will run on this because surplus sounds nice in itself. They'll say, "Oh, look, our fiscal responsibility. Nothing could be more fiscally irresponsible than them running a surplus right now." And I got to point out to folks too, we just had the fastest recovery in U.S. history prior to them running this budget surplus. Coming out of COVID, that recession, this was the fastest recovery in U.S. history. We never had a recession this short. How? Because we spent not as much as we should have, but we did spend semi-adequately, let's say. We spent enough that the recovery could occur very, very quickly. What can we do about inflation? And what is driving it right now? There are still, the demand side, the demand pull side isn't as serious as it was coming off of COVID. We still have some supply side issues. We still have these wasteful sectors I mentioned, healthcare, education, that could be reformed. But what we have now is the private sector using supply side shocks, war, increased wages, and we need to talk about that. How did the ipso facto minimum wage in this country get to basically $15 an hour while the actual legal minimum wage is still $7.75 or whatever? But corporate America is using those factors I just mentioned to price gouge. Now, what does MMT tell us about this? Well, as Stephanie Kelton would put it, she said, I used to work in retail. I know where prices came from. Ultimately, they came from my Sharpie pen. And that's absolutely right. Okay. The price is whatever it is you can get people to pay. All right. But the market is setting a relative price. And that relative price is the price that the government pays. And now this is really key. And people who don't understand markets, which, as most folks, understandably, don't get this. Markets can only set a relative price. It has to be relative to something. And that something is the currency monopolist. Because remember, the monopolist is the price maker, it's the price giver, and everyone else is the price taker. So we know who the currency monopolist is. It's the federal government. So what the federal government is paying for raw materials in particular, and for all of the sort of primary goods that go into developing finished goods, secondary goods, is the thing more than anything else that determines the price level. We can prove this. Let's take labor. Where did this $15 ipso facto minimum wage in the United States across the board more or less come from all of a sudden? Well, the legal minimum wage is so low. Well, it came from a couple of things. Remember, we were told that there was a labor shortage. Well, no, there was a capital strike. It's businesses were like, no, if you refuse to work for $10 an hour, I won't pay you. And then it was a game of chicken. And to the people's credit, we said, screw you guys. We're going to hold out until you're so desperate for profits that you're going to have to pay us more. But what else is interesting is that the government played the central role here and everybody missed it. Here's what they did. Joe Biden came out and said, remember, there was a so-called labor shortage, right? There was really just refuseniks, especially among millennials. There was a capital strike, really is what happened. They said, okay, nope. We're not gonna give you that amount. This is what we're gonna give you. And then as people continued to refuse, the price went up. But where did the point at which you had some equilibrium, right? Where you had clearance of the labor stock, where did it occur? When did it happen? It happened right after Joe Biden came out and made an announcement saying that the minimum that the federal government would pay its lowest paid contractor would be $15 an hour. As soon as that happened, all of a sudden the private sector was like, oh, hey, who wants to work for $15 an hour? Who wants to work for Target, Walmart? Who wants to work for $15 an hour? Right after Joe Biden made that announcement. Why? Because the government is the price setter. It's obvious. It's obvious. When you look at okay, what is the government willing to spend for a barrel of oil? All of a sudden you see, okay, the market is setting a relative price. Surplus value is setting a relative price. Okay, they need to make a profit. The government is willing to spend this much. That means we will spend this much, and there you go. That's what's happening. And it's happening. Okay, what about food? People will say, oh, well, how do you justify that claim in like prices at the supermarket? Well, ever heard of farm subsidies? That's the government as monopolist setting the price of your food. So when Randall Wray and we as MMTers tell people everything is already planned, your economy under capitalism exists in the private sector, right? It exists in the private sector, and it is responding to the currency monopolist. It is responding to the currency monopolist. So everything is already planned. It's just a question of how you want to plan it. How efficient is that planning? What are the political ideologies that are doing the planning? Who is benefiting from that planning? But everything is public mission. To leave a decision up to what the private sector can or cannot get for something based on the absolute price that the government is setting, keep in mind, is still a plan. So this idea of like, oh, we'll just, the government hands off and let the economy, no, that doesn't exist. Like, it's still setting a price to which the market has to respond. Now, if it's a matter of, well, we're not going to regulate that market, we're not going to do anything to stop monopoly practice or price gouging, okay, that too is a plan. That too is a plan that has quantifiable expected outcomes that can be measured.
Okay, with that, there's one question I have on the price setting function that we talk about here, and that is, how do the international markets and price setting of other governments affect it? Because that's not clear to me in the presentation MMT gives. So, for example, we buy raw products from countries that have different operating conditions and different natural currencies within their own limits.
Yes.
So how does that affect the overall economy in the United States or Canada or the EU as a whole, which the EU as a whole kind of sort of has monetary sovereignty, but not any individual nation in it. And it has legal constraints that actually stop it from having full monetary sovereignty, which is a whole different can of worms. But how does that affect planning? Because that's the one element that I've not heard totally dealt with.
Yeah. So the U.S. So let's take the case of oil, right? Let's take Saudi oil. Okay. So the U.S. can say we will only pay X number of dollars per barrel for the oil, and the Saudis can say, all right, well, we won't give it to you. Okay, we won't give it to you unless you meet this price requirement. At this level, we will sell you this oil. Okay, that still becomes the U.S. government setting the price, of which all other markets that rely on oil or that will use oil to manufacture goods will base their prices. That is still the U.S. setting the price of oil. Now, the fact that they may not have a lot of negotiating power in that dynamic, in that situation, doesn't change the fact that they're still price setter there. The U.S. could say in that situation, well, we refuse to pay, and we're just going to tap into our domestic strategic reserves. And we're going to do so at a fixed price with a very small surplus to those manufacturers, to those oil companies within our own shores. And that'll be that. Now, where I think that people should be critical of what some of those MMT insights that I've just gone over in relation to this spell out is that, take the price gouging. Well, what can be done? If this isn't really a demand pull situation, if it's not really a cost, if it's not being overwhelmingly driven by demand pull inflationary pressure, if it's not being driven by the cost push inflationary pressure overwhelming, if it's just using those demand pull and cost push inflationary pressures that exist and that are having an impact, but then piling on top of them through price gouging, then what can we do? Well, the only thing you can do is regulation. You see, now you're back to capital in control of your political system, and then the subservience of the political system to capital, and then having to rely on parliamentary democracy to get regulations through that say, okay, we will implement an excess profits tax, which will function to alleviate price gouging, or what in Japan is known, and I learned this from Rohan Gray and Stephanie Kelton's interview with Jon Stewart last week, I think, or a couple of weeks ago now, jawboning. I had never heard this expression, but because of Japanese culture, the way it operates, they can do this thing called jawboning, which is shaming the private sector into ending its price gouging practice, or else. And it's like the or else, watch out, like you will be in deep trouble, don't even try it, like the entire country will turn on you. So because of cultural reasons, they're able to communicate that, hey, what such and such industry, cut it out because the people aren't having it, and we might have to take drastic measures. And so that that's something that can be technically done here in the US in an American fashion. But it's the reliance on this that is the problem. So yes, it can be technically done. Like we can come in and set certain price controls. The other thing you have to understand is that the United States doesn't always realize when it's negotiating and bargaining and purchasing capital goods and services, natural resources, et cetera, that it is the price setter. It doesn't always understand that what it's paying has a repercussion down the line in the private economy, in financial markets. It doesn't realize that it is setting an absolute price by which markets will respond with relative prices, and then we will all pay the price for those relative prices set by the market against the government's absolute price-setting price. So that's a problem, is when you have a gross misunderstanding by public sector officials, especially the Treasury. Like Janet Yellen is absolutely horrendous at this. Like she's the absolute worst. She does not understand debt at all. She's terribly, terribly confused about sources of inflation. She's terribly, terribly confused about quantity of money. She is awful. She's awful. And her being there in that capacity is really kind of, not really kind of, but is a danger to our fiscal health as a nation. So what could be done right now? Okay, so a couple of things. Here's what I would do if I had the power. Okay, one is the budget deficits need to come back, and they need to come back in a huge way. And the way we bring them, that we deal with this is, I can't believe that, especially as like a parliamentary progressive, as an ideological anarchist, I'm having to say this. Never in my wildest dreams did I think I'd be in this position, but like, standing at the rooftops screaming like "Build Back Better," but like that might be, believe it or not, the thing that could thwart a rise of fascism in this country soon impending, and we'll get to that as it relates to the budget surpluses. But we need that extra spending, and we need that spending to deal with supply side issues. We need that spending to get to a full employment economy. We need that spending to eliminate all kinds of inefficiencies. We need that spending to focus on renewable energy and serious conservation, which can also control the price level. So it sounds counterintuitive. Like, Sam, you're advocating that we spend trillions more in order to mitigate this inflationary situation. The answer is yes, with proper regulations in place. So yes, to increasing aggregate demand is generally an inflationary pressure creating operation or situation, but under current conditions where we need to be rebuilding and retooling and producing more for people, the only way that that's going to happen, if you accept that investment is a function of demand, at least overwhelmingly a function of demand, which I do, then we need more investment. We need more investment in order to get more productive output to meet the levels of aggregate demand that we currently have. But that's not going to work unless we stop the price gouging. So again, now you're looking at like relying on elections in 2024 to do it. I don't see that happening. Here's what I do see happening. We're going to continue to see the budget surpluses. The economy is going to contract. Democrats are going to lose the House. They're going to lose the House this fall. Republicans will come in. I hope they don't. I mean, I'm not a Democrat. I'm not a Republican. But I mean, it's,
Yeah, but the odds were before any of this stuff. The Democrats were going to lose House and Senate. Now with
I think they'll keep the Senate.
Now with the war and Republicans being their own worst enemy, if you actually look at the state by state level stuff, it looks like that they might keep the Senate. That's the optimistic thing here. But in the long run, what we're seeing, because like you, I'm seeing two things happening in the next 3 months. It's going to start to freak people out. One, student loans are going to kick back in because Joe Biden's declared COVID over, so all the ideological excuse of COVID for not kicking student loans back in is going to go away. And two, we're going to start seeing incremental and small but real raise to the bank lending rate. And then on top of that, I think we're going to see food instability. Not so much that we're going to feel it in America that we won't have food, but that food inflation may even kick up higher than is currently predicted at 7 to 8%.
Yeah.
Because a whole lot of the world grain just left the market entirely. So so we have these three conditions, and the Democrats seem unable to do anything but maybe run on their position on the Ukraine war, but hope really hard that they don't actually have to deliver on their position on the Ukraine war, because the war's popularity would immediately drop as soon as Americans started dying there. Right. So this does not look good. Plus, I implied this in a question a while back. This is what I want you to talk about. Republicans have historically actually used MMT conditions, even though they speak to the public totally in neoclassical terms.
Right. Yeah. No. Absolutely. Okay. So let's tackle both of those. On the election piece, if Democrats lose the House, what we can expect is very clear in terms of political economy. Is that the final 2 years of Biden's term, just nothing will get done. Okay. Like the Republicans, if they control the House, they're going to obstruct any kind of new appropriation spending. So nothing will get done. Zero.
Just like in the Obama years. So we're back
to that.
Right,
exactly. So nothing. So the chance to get the necessary spending into the economy to kickstart things and to increase productive output to meet the rise in aggregate demand, and the regulatory possibilities for cutting down on price gouging and certain monopoly practices, sector by sector, all of that will be gone if the Republicans take the House this fall. So you'll have 2 years of nothing happening. And you'll probably continue to get a steady rise in inflation as a result of the appropriate measures the necessary measures I just mentioned not being implemented. And then what will happen is the Republicans will go, and the economy, the worst thing is the economy will contract, as I said, because people will be dipping into savings because there's no new spending. If you have a budget surplus, and I've been looking at the Treasury General, the Treasury accounts, and people can, the daily Treasury statement, and people can find this. By the way, it's public information. The Treasury publishes its daily Treasury statement daily, hence the name, and you can look to see withdrawals and deposits and see where we're at. We're currently running a surplus. It's not good. So the economy will contract. Credit will expand as a result to make up for the lost money in the economy, the deleted money in the economy, as accounts are drawn down. And that could lead, if the surpluses are big enough, to some sort of credit bubble somewhere in the economy that pops towards the end of Biden's term. Very serious situation, right? Because they will be running the Democrats on a budget surplus from this November all the way into the 2024 election. And the Republicans are just going to hammer them with inflation. They're going to hammer them with inflation. So think about the world that we're living in. Okay, we're living in a world where the very thing that the Democrats will be running on, okay, which is their budget surplus, will have been the thing that significantly contributes, all right, to the thing that the Republicans are attacking them on, which is the inflation. The Republicans won't say that, and they won't know it, okay? All right. And those who do won't say it publicly. And the Democrats won't realize it either. They won't make the connection that their budget surplus is materially contributing in the worst ways to the very thing that they're getting hit over the head with by the Republicans, which is inflation. So the Democrats will say, oh, well, sure, there's 8-9% inflation, but look, we have a budget surplus. We're being fiscally disciplined. This is like a backwards, surrealist world of misunderstanding that could lead to very serious doom. Why? Because if you have that credit bubble pop and you have a rising inflation, that is just a fertile breeding ground for a honest demagogue. And I don't mean honest as in truth telling, but as in uncorrupt, to emerge in the 2024 election on the Republican side. And then we could get bona fide fascism coming into the United States in the electoral arena in a way that we've never seen before. And that's what happens when you have inflationary pressure. When people's purchasing power, hits the skids and earnings isn't keeping up with that decline in purchasing power. Purchasing power in and of itself is not the issue. It's purchasing power relative to time and income, or income over time. And so when you don't have income keeping up or exceeding that loss in purchasing power, people tend to get angry, as they should. So and I want to, at some point before we conclude, also talk a little bit about the idea of the value of the dollar, price of the dollar, cost of the dollar. But there was a second part to what you wanted to ask me. And then there was also some questions about QE you wanted to ask, I think.
Yeah. So on QE, so
did I answer everything that you were?
You did actually.
Okay.
I would add that, whatever my skepticism of MMT may or may not be, I have looked at the same data as you and historical trends, and I agree with you. Whenever you have a budget surplus, or you try to run a balanced budget, and I'm not just talking about it in the States. Like, you can look at the SPD in Germany, both modern and historical, under Hilferding in the 20s, you see the same thing, and it's usually a center-left party running the state that does it, oddly. And when it happens, you have a reactionary response. You have a labor becomes depressed, so it doesn't participate, or veers even slightly right. And other class factors start to emerge up and start voting. And that's when you start getting these weird unstable class coalitions that lead to fascist, Nazi, reactionary, whatever. We can get into the semantics of the precise terms. I know people might object to one or the other, but you get a very reactionary, nationalist or populist response almost inevitably. Right. We have more than one example and even in the States, I mean, you see that Clinton to Bush, you see it Carter to Reagan, you see it. The weird exception actually is when the Republicans were the more progressive party.
Oh, right.
20s.
The Republicans. Why? Right. And why they're acting more in accord with MMT.
Right. Why do they naturally act more in
accord
accord with MMT principles, since they don't explain the economy to themselves in those terms?
Yeah. Let's do this. So, okay. Reagan, for example, all right, ran massive budget deficits, contributed greatly, comparatively, maybe more than any president since like Roosevelt, or no, maybe any president since I think Lyndon Johnson with the Great Society plus Vietnam, major contribution to the so-called national debt. But why did that expand the economy? Plus, you had tax cuts. So you had this expanding national debt as a result of tax cuts and increased spending. Okay, so yeah, increased spending and tax cuts are going to increase aggregate demand. It's going to put people back to work. Okay, when there is more aggregate demand, there is more investment. And how do you generate aggregate demand? Well, one of the best ways is to spend money. Now, where did he spend it? He spent it on the military. But guess what? The military requires goods and services from all kinds of natural resources and all sorts of primary goods as well, right? So like, okay, there's all kinds of things that military spending requires the manufacture of that will lead to employment, that will lead to a rise in aggregate demand. There's just no way about that. It's this productive spending in and of itself is going to do that. Now, maybe you and I don't like what that productive spending is aimed at. Like, okay, I don't. All right. Hey, it's to increase the military industrial complex. It's to expand and enlarge that. But that spending is also spending that is productive spending and all of the goods and services that come with enlarging that sector of the economy. So plus the tax cuts. Now, the thing with tax cuts are this. It depends who they are. Tax cuts on a macro level, that has a similar effect to increased spending, depending on who it is the tax cuts are targeted towards. But here's the thing. One has more of a potentially inflationary, I'll put it to you this way. If I give $100 million to the bottom 1 million people in the United States, okay, so what is that? I'm giving them $100 each, right? Bottom 1 million on the net wealth distribution curve, I'm giving them $100 each, okay? And versus, now, if you do that, and this is what velocity of money is about in part, that money is going to be spent, okay? If you give that money to the people at the bottom, like they're going to use that to catch up on bills, they're going to use that for food, everyday expenses, like that money is spent into the economy. So there's the inflationary, it's not much inflationary pressure, it's only $100 for a million people, but the point remains to make. That money is money that gets spent. So there's some inflationary pressure. I didn't say inflation, but inflationary pressure. Now, if I give that $100 million to the top 100 people, okay? So now I'm giving 1%ers, or it's like 1/10 of 1%, like 1/1000th of 1%. The people at the very, very, very top, the top 100 net asset holders in the country, okay? I'm giving them $1 million each. It's still $100 million that I've spent into the economy, but now I'm only giving it to 100 people, right? Instead of 1 million people, all right? The effect on aggregate demand is non-existent. Why? Those guys are all billionaires. You think they're going to take that money that I just gave them and run out and go like, all right, now I'm going to buy more groceries and put even more gas in my car? Like, no, it doesn't work that way. They might go into financial markets. They might go into private markets and buy some stock. They're going to find some way to save that money and wait for a return on investment. Okay. And that's what velocity of money is about in part, is that when you give money to people who are going to be more likely to actually spend it as opposed to save it, all right, that's going to have an effect on aggregate demand in the economy. But when you give that money to people who are more likely to save it, there's no effect, or the effect is negligible. And so what Reagan did is like, yeah, most of those tax cuts went to people at the top, okay, but there's a negligible effect mostly on inflation. And then, yeah, the people in the middle and bottom are also affected, although not as greatly in terms of real dollars anyway, on what they got. But those two things, like mad spending on, yes, it was on the military, but it was still spending that led to increased aggregate demand, plus tax cuts. So that's very much active. And what happened? Like, did the economy tank and was it Armageddon? No. So that is very much acting in accordance with MMT. Now, why does that happen with the right? Well, because they're very determined to spend on certain things that they think that for political reasons can be overlooked in terms of their framework of fiscal discipline and responsibility and prudence. So what they'll say, the implicit message to the constituency is, well, but this is defense. But this is defense. There's always money for this, right? There has to be, because this is our safety and security. But then as soon as the Democrats take control, they just start screaming, balanced budget, balanced budget, balanced budget, balanced budget, balanced budget. But as soon as they get in power, they forget about balanced budgets and fiscal discipline and everything else, and they just start spending. But notice that the spending is overwhelmingly on things like the military and tax cuts, right? And that benefits a certain segment of the population over others. But the macroeconomic picture is still one that is rosier than if you were to run a surplus in a country like the United States. So it's interesting because Dick Cheney has mentioned, he's on the record as saying that, quote, Reagan-proved deficits don't matter, which is not entirely what MMT is saying, but along that same path. Yes, they matter, but only until the point of real resource availability, only to the point of triggering inflation. And so it's not about deficit being good or bad. It's not about a surplus being, quote, good or bad. It's matching the surplus to what it is you have in the economy to absorb that spending. So the spending has to be in line with the public mission. You might not like the public mission. I might not like the public mission. I might like it. You might like it, but somebody else might not. But if your goal is X, Y, Z, now you have to check. You have to plan and say, okay, if I'm trying to accomplish this, it's going to cost this many dollars. Can I spend this money without triggering inflation? Let me see what resources are available in the economy to do it. Okay. And so it requires better planning. But remember, our argument in MMT land is that everything is already planned. It's just how well do you want to do the planning? So for Republicans, they've actually been planning it pretty well to meet the outcomes that they want to achieve. So that was Cheney on Reagan. Donald Rumsfeld said, true story, told Warren Mosler early on when he was thinking about this stuff that he bumped into Donald Rumsfeld in a sauna. Like he happened to be at, like, you know, whatever, some sports club, and he walks into a sauna, and who's there? It's Donald Rumsfeld, of all people. And so he thought to himself, I'm going to take this opportunity to run it by this guy because he was an insider. I want to know. And Rumsfeld said, yeah, that's right. We know that. It's like, yeah, we operate based on those principles. You're on the right track. So yeah, the bonds, it's like none of this is financing the spending. Like there are people inside the Republican Party, inside the White House, who know this. And so
Michael Hudson has told his anecdote that that the right wing of military defense figured this out in the 70s.
Yeah, exactly. Right. There's always money for it because there's literally always money for it. As long as the economy can absorb the spending, you're fine. You're not going to trigger inflation. Now, we could be spending that money on something else and still not triggering inflation, like housing every person who's houseless in this country. You could do that. You know, there's so much fiscal space. If you determine you have 75 units more of I'm just making an arbitrary number, 75 more units of fiscal space available before you're going to trigger some sort of inflationary episode. Now you have a choice. What do I want to spend those 75 units on? Do I want to spend them on more F-15, F-22 fighters, or do I want to spend them on making sure everybody gets an education that won't leave them in debt peonage when they get out? And that takes us to the student loan situation. Biden could just do this by stroke of the pen and not trigger any sort of, oh my God, we're going to be leaving this debt to our grandchildren. There's no debt. That's not it. It's the spending is literally the savings of the private sector, and he can wipe out that debt without any negative consequences to the economy whatsoever. Except, some private equity folks will be unhappy because actually, they won't be unhappy. They're going to get paid. Those loans, the government's going to pay the loans. So even they're happy. So who benefits, by the way, from a credit economy, which is where the Democrats are leading us right now? And by the way, a month from now, I could check those Treasury statements, and it could go the other way. We could be back in deficit. But it's going to require the Democrats spending. And how are we going to get that spending if they can't even get Build Back Better through? I don't see where it's going to come from in any significant degree. But if we get that spending, what was I saying right before I made that?
That we were talking. We were talking about we could get spending, but we were also talking about the fact that the reasons why debt's not forgiven can't be because of cost. And honestly,
right. So who benefits? From the kind of economy that the Democrats are running right now? Now this gets interesting, right? So where is Joe Biden from? He's from Delaware, right? Which is like the banking capital of the country, right? It's the credit capital of the United States. Who benefits from a budget surplus, in the United States is the private equity industry. Why? Because you have expanding credit. So as businesses start to fail, or first they're going to require loans, and if they can't meet their credit obligations, they fail. What happens? Private equity comes in, buys up whatever's left of the business, and then sells it off, right? Makes a killing. They buy it for cheap, they turn around and sell the various bits and pieces that made that firm a firm off to the highest bidder, or they'll just absorb it, refunction it, retool it, rebrand it, whatever, downsize it and get it up and running, but now at a profit again. So private equity loves this kind of an economy.
And unfortunately, Democrats have had a history since the 90s in favoring private equity.
Yeah, exactly.
You could literally, when people talk about two parties of capital, I'm like, yeah, but I can even tell you what sectors of capital the two parties favor. Republicans tend to favor extractive and commodity and physical commodity producing industries, and Democrats tend to favor rent seeking and private equity. And that wasn't always true, by the way. That is a product of the last 30 years, but it's predictable. Anyway, go back on. I just
you nailed it. You nailed it. And they're not even making the connection. Joe Biden's not sitting there going I will run a budget surplus and that will please and that'll be great for the
I wish they were that competent. Actually, it's not how it works.
Yeah, he knows that they like it and they're happy with it, but he thinks it's because it's fiscally responsible and it's going to lead to a bigger economy and greater productivity and growth. And by the way, speaking of which, I should point out, lest anybody get the wrong idea, MMT is true regardless of whether or not you have, MMT is no less accurate in a zero growth or even degrowth paradigm. It's not reliant on an ever-expanding GDP in order to be empirically the case. So one can still operate a functioning economy that maximizes resources and mitigates runaway inflation, leads to full employment without GDP growth. And I think actually MMT, better than any school of economic thought, shows us how that's possible, that we can get there. Economically speaking, we if we wanted to, and I think that, given the state of the world with anthropogenic climate change, it's not a bad idea to keep this on our very short term, like very near, term horizon for like the indefinite future from that point going forward, is a zero growth or even degrowth paradigm. We don't need to be targeting perpetual growth, okay, and I mean in terms of GDP here, in order to have full employment and price stability. That's not required. We can still have full employment and price stability without having to buy into the paradigm of infinite growth. We're going to have to reel capitalism in, though, and that's really the next part of the conversation I want to have with you is, where are we in terms of future of work under capital? I think things are getting sad and ugly, especially for young people. Look, we're handing out degrees for all kinds of things that when people hit the workforce are not marketable. And I don't think necessarily should be. Look, if you're a classics major, okay, your university is creating more and more admins per instructors, but they would rather keep you as a grad student or a postdoc or a doctoral student because you're cheap labor.
Yeah,
right?
that's what you're for.
That's it. Cheap labor. Why would they want to make you a professor? We'll put you on a TA track. So that's academia. And then you have weak labor unions in the trades. That's, discipline right there, capital discipline. That's labor discipline by capital, That doesn't look great. The future is not bright there. And so in Marxist terms, this just leads to a lot of alienation. We're creating a generation of folks who I think understand the score. It's like, okay, I go to college between 18 and 22. I learn about all of these things that, maybe I find incredibly stimulating and valuable, but yeah.
The credential isn't even going to be like the credential I get in most cases isn't going to matter. Even if I get a credentialed job, like that's
bingo.
Like what the credential's in is kind of irrelevant, which means that this has been a way to acute. First, I honestly think it was a way early on to limit people entering the labor market to hide unemployment. But now I actually think it functions as something different with the expansion of loans as just a major form of compelled labor. Because a lot of people, if you don't have that, you don't have to enter the same kind of labor relations. You don't have to put up with the same shit. You just don't. Which is also why I think they won't forgive it. And I don't think this is conscious on the people think when I say stuff like this that Joe Biden is thinking this.
Right. No, it's the function. Yeah, no, exactly. And mostly it's liberals who think that that's what we're saying when we say that. Like, no, he's not sitting there and having that. This is the result of a series of events and processes that have taken place over decades. And there were, folks, if you go back far enough to when this was really being contemplated and they had policy influence, the Trilateral Commission under Brzezinski, right, and others who got together to evaluate what had happened in the West, particularly in the United States during the 1960s and early 70s. What did they come up with? They said there was an excess of democracy, and in order for capital to have the disciplined labor force it needed to restore order, we would need to constrain and restrict the amount of free resources and time that young people would have going forward. That would provide labor with what it needed. That would provide the state with the level of that would act as a bulwark against civil unrest, which really, what they refer to as the excesses of excess democracy. Okay. And that's where we are now. That's where we are now. So go learn history, get really well informed about something, be able to have a conversation about it, but then you better have the mind of a coder, because when you get out, history is not a marketable thing. You're competing with way too many other people for an academic career that's not going to pay nearly as well as becoming a programmer. This is a sad future. And by the way, Silicon Valley is hip to this. And having worked among these like so-called liberal Silicon Valley types, I can tell you, like, their thing by and large culturally when it comes to the future of work is like they understand not everyone has the predisposition to be a coder. In their mind, that's a matter of intelligence. They are completely and utterly abhorrently wrong about that. That has nothing to do with intelligence and everything to do with disposition. I mean, there are plenty of highly intelligent, curious people who are not predisposed to coding. And then there are those who are, but would prefer not to do it if they didn't have to in order to make a living. And by the way, like, I'm not trying to pick on programming. It's just I'm using that as an example because of the degree to which it's a, ever expanding, enlarging market for labor. Right. And so it's
the only STEM field that actually has the growth that people attribute to STEM fields. All the other STEM fields that you can go into, you would actually be, in some cases, actually better off being an English major. And I say this because I've looked at the empirical studies on it. Coding and biological engineering and like two other fields are the ones where there's actually STEM jobs. Everything else are actually, I hate to tell you, they're pushing STEM to try to use competition to drop wages. That's what they're doing.
Yeah.
No,
that's exactly what's going on.
And that is known. Like, if you can find policy papers where they admit this. So it's
And Silicon Valley's solution to this is like, I mean, it's some dystopic shit. That's why they love UBI, because the whole idea behind UBI for them, like the Andrew Yang style of UBI, at least, which is the generally thought of, conventionally understood sort of mainstream UBI, is okay, well, we know not everybody can be a coder. So we'll give everybody $1,000 and we'll do everything, and that'll be a Trojan horse to cutting off benefits in other areas. So like, we're going to get rid of food stamps. We're going to get rid of like, Section 8 housing programs. We're going to get rid of like this, that, and the other thing. I mean, I'm having trouble thinking of anything because there's like really no welfare.
Because we've already done it so much.
Yeah. So,
but it would be total neoliberalization of the Well, that's what they would love to get, because disability is one of the areas where there is still some kind of welfare net. And
right. SSDI and SSI, yeah.
Right. Although anytime that you turn something into from a service into a payment, you are decreasing jobs. So that's another thing I try to tell people. Like, the reason why they talk about that as efficiency is because it decreases jobs, it decreases control, and when you neoliberalize it, it enables rent seeking on the public dollar. So it's actually in some ways even like, it's one of these weird places where like Marxist MMTers and then like super reactionary ordo liberals from the 19th century agree. Like, where we're just like, oh, that neoliberalism is like the worst of all worlds. It's still super state centric and people don't realize it, but it actually in many ways even removes competition. I mean, it's crazy what it does. But yeah, they love UBI because we could get rid of all the social safety net, but the UBI, and unless UBI is highly attuned to inflation, you're going to have the same problems that you do with
Right.
with
and because it's universal, it has to be inherently inflationary because it's not anchored to anything. Like
right.
it's not anchored to any sort of like there's no productive output. Like there's no productive output inherent to it. Like one could make the argument that like, okay, you know, the number that gets thrown around is $1,000 a month. Like how am I and like 9 buddies who are also getting $1,000 a month going to take that money and turn it into some like enterprise that will then yield productive output and allow us to hire people and like, you know,
we're all going to be
go
streamers in the future.
Yeah, we're all going to be Etsy. We're all going to be Etsy entrepreneurs in the future. You know, we'll have just enough for like, you know, maybe a sandwich, eating out once a week kind of deal, barely enough to pay the rent, and everything else will just be, you know, hey, you've got your UBI and just shut up. And that's really the attitude at Silicon Valley. Is like there's a lot of implicit contempt for the poor in this country among the liberal class in Silicon Valley. And given the influence that they have, especially over the Democratic Party and how the Democratic Party will choose to steer appropriations, remember, that is legislation that requires new spending. I think the future looks pretty grim in the United States. I see very seriously as a possibility, maybe even a very good, maybe even a very decent probability at this point, some sort of techno-feudal capitalism coming, which is going to be led by guys like Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, and others. And, you know, this is Hollywood sci-fi dystopia from the left impending at this point. How do we get out of it? This is where your buddy and mine, the Swoletariat, I think is nails it, is that we're going to need some sort of revolutionary thought, and some, not just revolutionary thought, but revolutionary action. And I think that we're going to have to send a message to the system, and we're also going to have to do something that functions very much outside of the system's normal channels. Now, for somebody like the Swoletariat, that's, you know, more than just seizing the means of production. That's about seizing state institutions and then changing them. I'm less thrilled about or less like on board with that, only because I think, well, for a lot of reasons. One, I'm an anarchist. I'm not a Marxist, although I am heavily influenced by Marx. I mean, my flag is definitely black and red. But with state arms of violence, especially the police, stacked so far against us, and the levels of indoctrination coming up that have come up to this point, as far as how we teach our citizens, and the level of division that goes on. Like right now we're being divided up in ways that I don't think the country has seen ever. There's echoes of the 1930s going on right now, but the level of division and subculture and atomization in this country is so postmodern, so out of control. Everybody is in their own little truth bubbles, their own little confirmation bias cells, especially on the internet. It's a post-truth world. How do you compete with that in terms of narrative and overcome structural violence, political violence, disinformation, and bad science? That's a lot to be up against.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's actually harder in some ways than it was in the 19th and early 20th century, where these ideas were so new that there weren't competitor bad versions of them in many ways. That, you know, there's like 2 games in town. It was classical liberalism, I guess, reactionaryism outright, and various forms of leftism, which at that time agreed more. And we're not in that world. I also think, my thesis is that while the state's super important to the economy and only become more so, state state power and boundaries are going to become weaker and weaker for natural reasons, unless some very real stuff is happening, because the movements of peoples and all that are going to make maintaining what we think of as current, our current imaginary line world going to be very hard to, I mean, I think we're already beginning to see it. And unfortunately, I think this Ukraine-Russia reshuffling a multipolar world stuff means that borders are going to be moving all the time again, the way they were in the middle of the 20th century, and people are going to be moving all the time again. There'll be refugee crisis after refugee crisis, and the states have not geared up to deal with it. So I don't say this because I think the future is entirely negative. I actually don't. This is a place where you could dual power institutions. Another thing that Marxists and anarchists have historically agreed on, which, because we will see state failures, but we really have to start thinking about what it's going to mean, because the one thing you don't want to happen is either of these two class blocks planning out what we're shifting into, as it's becoming clear that 19th, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th century capitalism cannot be maintained in the same way to survive. And they know that too. Like, that's the one thing I will say. Like, I've talked to some people with connections in the military. I have some friends who are former military contractors, and they're like, yeah, they know, they're planning for how to maintain state power as it becomes more and more unstable, and employments get weirder, and this, that, and the other, and they are worried about it. Like, it's I think that's part of what's driving the Civil War narratives we're hearing out of liberals, even though I'm also like, yeah, but we're so fractured and fragmented. Like, there's no geographical basis for what you guys are, like, you're invoking the U.S. Civil War when what you actually mean is something like the Days of Lead in Italy. Like, which for those of you who don't know, that's like 10% of the population killing the other 10% of the population, alternating which one's killing whom, and getting the other 80% caught in the middle, but nothing actually changing in government because there's no base of power or geographical base or elite attached to it. It just sort of like just destabilizes society. Like, and when you have a lot of unemployed young people, that's highly likely.
And either unemployed or employed, but just have turned into utter bots.
Employed is shit. That'll also do it. Like,
I mean, look, and it's across the board in corporate America too. I see it all the time. It's Graeber referred to them as bullshit jobs. I don't fully accept that thesis. Like, yeah, a lot of them are, but more than there being bullshit jobs in white collar work these days, there are just meaningless jobs. So that the job might be necessary to the functioning of something that expands capital and therefore makes,
usually a legal requirement.
Usually a what?
It's usually like cost disease and all that. There's an expansion of capital under legal requirements. Like, that's why it's done.
Yes. So, yes, I will. I mean, in some cases, the job is bullshit. Like, it doesn't need to exist at all, but somebody wants a lackey, for example, or the fact that there's somebody there counting certain beans, even though there's already somebody employed that could be counting those beans, makes people feel better about control, hierarchy, expansion, company growth, what have you. So, like, I do think that there are quite a number of bullshit jobs in the corporate sector that are actually functioning as a drag on the bottom line of the balance sheet of the firm. However, I think it's more often the case that whatever those people are being paid, the company is extracting value beyond what it's paying those employees by having them there, but that the job itself is just absolutely meaningless and does not require the amount of time that the person is spending each week in order to get it done. So there you have, again, a case of capital disciplining labor. Like, God forbid Like if that person, if it turns out they can get that done in 20 hours, well, how many other people that we're hiring could get that done, their jobs done in half the time? And then what would that mean for the firm at large? And then what would that mean for society? And what would that mean for control over people's time and energy? And, you know, from a propaganda perspective, like it also serves as a potential calamity for state power to have people working half as many hours as they are now, especially if they can produce the same output by having to work without having to work as long. Time and resources is a danger to state power. It always has been. If you are secure and you have free time from forced labor, from that work which is paid and therefore required for you to earn a living, you are a potential threat to the structure of power should you find anything let's say unethical or exploitative about it. And that's what happened in the US in the 60s and early 70s is, you know, young people freaked out and they had the time and resources to freak out. They had the time and resources to take a look at what was wrong around them and in their relationship with power and the government and what was being done in their name and with civil liberties. And they were able to do something about it, and it civilized the population and the society here for sure. And then there was a major backlash, both in terms of capital and social movements.
The only complication I will have that vision is that civilizational mission was very classed, and it was interesting because when I say it's classed, I don't mean it was all upper class. It was actually a weird coalition of educated children of working class people from the GI Bill, marginalized people who had enough money to survive, which is a step up from the past, but were still largely shut out of society, and some very specific elites. And what I find interesting that we need to like study, for example, is everyone talks about the liberal nature of education, and I'm like, well, but until the 70s, education was like literally the most conservative institution in America. I suspect if we got over the liberal gloss and looked at what it actually did and not what it said, we would discover that it's still one of the most conservative institutions in America.
Especially elite education. I mean, it's very much trying to maintain a certain status quo. It sort of extols some of the virtues of like interpersonal liberalism and freedom to explore ideas, but definitely within a certain corridor of expectations, depending on the kind of institution. And the more elite the institution, the more confined or narrow that corridor.
I think we're going to see a lot of that. And I think we're going to see a lot of things becoming more seemingly conservative that brands itself as left. And we're also going to have more and more actual reactionary movements with increasing mass bases of people as the pressure on, this is one thing I don't fault MMT for, because MMT doesn't claim to do this. So it's not a fault of MMT. It's just it's a limitation of only using that one paradigm, is it doesn't deal with class hardly at all. It's a monetary theory. It kind of shouldn't actually, but when you look at
there are class implications.
There are definitely class implications, and and I think that's where my difference from the liberal MMTers come in. Is I'm like, well, but the power dynamics that this system exists within is going to favor right-wing implementation of ideas that are implied by MMT. That is not because MMT is inherently anything, although all economics get normative and prescriptive kind of confused, but there is a reality that you have to look at. Once you put a class gloss on this, some things become more likely than others, And a lot of the policies that someone like Nathan Tankus would propose, which I'm just like, yeah, but what are the incentives for anyone to do that? And the answer is outside of us making them, not a lot.
There aren't any, especially under, like, as long as under capital relations, there is an incentive for coercion and subordination, like, other than us just voting in the folks who will make things more egalitarian, like, there's no inherent incentive. There's no inherent incentive. As long as you have capitalism, like, there is no inherent incentive there. Like, I may be an anarchist, but I also believe that there is a natural state of capitalism. Like, I'm 100% on board with Marxists on this, 100% on board. Like, obviously, if you have a system that is based on an infinite growth paradigm and the expansion of something that leads, as observed since its inception, to the concentration of wealth, resources, and power in fewer and fewer hands, the longer it's in the absence of any sort of external intervention by a counterbalancing force, such as the government, which is also making capital possible to begin with, by the way.
Yeah, which is itself a capitalist force enabling the whole thing to work. But yeah.
Yes. If like, you could the government be there as is it a facilitator of a legal system that makes capitalism possible? Yes. I mean, that's my take. Would most Marxists probably take umbrage with me on that? Maybe, I'm not sure, but probably. But the fact remains that, like, I do believe that the natural state of capitalism is an ever increasing concentration of capital in fewer and fewer hands. Is also monopoly power, because if the whole point is to defeat the competition and lay waste to them, then
you eventually do.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And if it's based on, infinite, it's based, sure, it's a system that's based on scarcity for sure. But the contradiction of one of many is the infinite growth paradigm of the system. Like, okay, it's based simultaneously on expansion for ad infinitum and scarcity. Like, that's not something that's sustainable. So yeah, I think that, there are those Tankus and others, and Nathan identifies as a libertarian socialist, which is just a polite term for anarchist. But, I've challenged him in person before on, hey, if one were to say we're not doing anarchist economics in there, pointing to the MMT conference room we were both standing outside of for the, how would you respond, and him not having a response, then that's a problem. But the question is, I would answer that challenge myself if somebody were to ask that of me by saying, well, is it still relevant to understanding an economy regardless of the features that exist within that economy? I am all for the abolition of surplus value and private property. Okay. Mm-hmm. But that doesn't mean that there won't be an economy with other features in it that MMT won't be able to provide me guidance and understanding to help operate, even, no matter how self-directed it is. And I am not even somebody who is particularly keen on keeping currency around, by the way. And we have to understand, I don't think I mentioned this early on, is that money predates capitalism. Money by a millennia predates capitalism.
Probably by 2 or 3 millennia predates capitalism.
Go. So whatever, I'm not saying, oh, well, it's inevitable that we'll have to keep currency around in some future world. I'm more, although having said that, that's an optimistic statement, because I'm not sure we get to that future world where it even becomes a possibility. I think we're more likely to probably annihilate ourselves in nuclear holocaust or via anthropogenic climate change before we get to a nation stateless world. But having said that, I'm not about rearranging. I'm not about rearranging chairs on the Titanic as it sinks either. Like, I'm willing and able to fight like hell to steer the ship away from the iceberg. I just think that there's so much dissonance and conflict and confusion around how that is done by the wider left when we're up against an ever calcifying right that is looking more and more like a death cult, which is what fascism, among other things, fundamentally is. And how do you deal with that? And here we have an administration, a political body that, like, they're not going to improve the material well-being significantly of people who did and did not vote for them in the bottom, say 80% over the course of the next 2.5 years. And what will that lead to? It'll lead to an ever calcifying right. It'll lead to an ever calcifying militant right, including by groups like the Proud Boys. It will create sympathy for those who are advocating for violent right-wing solutions to our problems and identifying undesirables as they see it as the problem. And that's a recipe for disaster.
I mean, you could easily have actually a pretty far right movement actually use the movement you're describing to pitch itself as not as far right as it actually is, and achieve. I mean, we're already seeing it. That's what national conservatism is to the alt right. What, like, I don't know. I don't. It's hard to think of a left wing equivalent that wouldn't piss somebody off. But like, but it is what is a softening and removal of the explicit racial. In fact, actually, it does give up on some of the explicit racialism, but in exchange for ethnic chauvinism, melting pot ideologies, national integralism and corporatism. And if you don't believe me that that's where the right has moved, just go read the National Review and even the Never Trumpers who are arguing for a national conservatism. And that part of how they're arguing for it is, look, if you don't put us in power, you're going to have the Q weirdos to deal with.
Right.
Right. because the left, quote unquote, can't do it. And this is at a time when, like, you and I don't really give a shit about the DSA, but the DSA, for all of its massive expansion in the past 5 years, has lost a fifth of its membership in a few months. Yeah. So, like, you think, and since it is wedded to the Democratic Party, in fact, more so now than it was even a few months ago, do you think that's gonna stop when they start losing? Like, it might, I guess, but it also creates this perverse incentive where, like, the left to the slight left of the Democrats actually starts hoping for the right wing to win so that it can increase its base, which is mind-blowingly idiotic as a long-term strategy.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of a repetitive thing in the neoliberal age in American politics. Is the left comes out, or the liberals come out, and the progressives come out every time there is a right-wing foothold in the country. Now it's okay to be anti-war. Now it's okay to rail against the rich to an extent. But then as soon as the Democrats get in power, it's like we have to, they have to silence all criticism of aspects of that administration that resemble that which they were just, in the park with their signs about, because otherwise it just feeds the other side. So there's this self-censorship and this lack of principled grounding among mainstream liberals in this country. There's just a ton of hypocrisy, and we see this during, like, the Ukraine crisis as well, in all sorts of ways. And it's sad because you cannot avoid a highly coordinated and single-voiced effort by the right that is also presumably going to be well armed, with the kind of sort of liberal politics that we see play out. I think, and I've said especially recently, that too many of America's liberals that are at least, ostensibly politically engaged, are going to be too willing, based on just their actions over the last few years, to become good Germans should there be some serious right-wing takeover of this country.
I mean, I think we've seen it already, frankly, in the way liberals and leftists have been chopping at the bit to pick up one side or the other of this Ukraine-Russia crisis, which is not even a major crisis that directly affects them. But like I have heard more actually from people who back Ukraine because they're more popular in the U.S. right now, but make what is effectively neoconservative arguments.
Yes.
I've heard it from everybody, but and I have seen this and just gone, well, like most people's leftism goes away when times get hard. Now, there are actually psychological studies that indicate that's the fact that's kind of a concept you have to factor in and deal with when you're doing leftist planning. Is stress is a quote conservatizing factor unquote, in the not in the sense that it would lead to like you to adopt Republican or reactionary positions, but it would push you in a temperament to where those positions are more easily adopted into your worldview, which like is a subtle distinction but an important one. And we are going to be living under those conditions. I mean, yeah. I think that's absolutely true.
Well, I mean, my only question my question about that would be, is that really the case? Because isn't sort of, material deprivation, I would think of that as more of a catalyst for people's left views becoming even more left, right? Or like I think of somebody I know who was in academia said to me, who was on strike last year. It was a university-wide strike across departments. She said, when this started years ago, I was just trying to get dental care. Now that 2 years later or whatever, that we're still fighting for it. They've radicalized me in all kinds of ways.
Well, radicalization and conservatization are actually psychologically pretty much the same process, which is an interesting thing to point out. But like, what matters is what content you have. The problem with a lot of liberals, and I'm hesitant to generalize about liberals in general on my show because the word barely means anything anymore. But that's my point. When people advocate like general left liberalism in America, you have no idea what they're actually advocating. I mean that somewhat like it's an incoherent melange of things that have different interest groups, different historical associations, and the number one thing in popular culture, and I'm talking about us here, is that it's whatever the Democrats have done is defined as left, except when they don't do it, I guess. And then the conflation of liberalism and leftism in America, which was also deliberate, to such a point where people don't know that left-wing ideologies, while they do emerge out of liberalism, they've been in dialogue with historical liberalism since the 18th century. They are a separate thing. Yeah. And they have long since become a separate thing. But also, frankly, when Marxists and anarchists throw the word liberal around now, they use it so broadly and as a slur that it also doesn't really mean anything.
Yeah. I mean, for me, it's like if I could do a topology, at this point, maybe I will. I'm gonna give my socialism topology.
All right.
Got the whiteboard. I'm gonna do it real quick. At this point, why not? So, and this is yeah, okay, you guys can see that. That's
Yeah, everyone can see you. So
all right. Yeah, the board is there. All right. So all right. Now this first one, and this is not in any particular order, okay? But I know that there are going to be those ideologies that take issue with the first one I'm going to put up here. I'm going to put it up here, and then we'll go over it. But again, no particular order. So the way that I provide or explain as far as like topology of ideologies that could fall under the socialist rubric is social democracy, Marxism, and anarchism. Those are the three types of socialism for me. And then the goals of each, and then any sort of transitional process. So for social democracy, it's reform capitalism, right? Marxism to communism with dictatorship of the proletariat as the transitional phase, and then anarchism to communism without that intermediary step. And I know that for a lot of Marxists, they would not consider social democracy to be part of the topology. But
well, I mean, it's. I would love to be able to kick them out.
I mean, I agree with you. I think social democracy is a form of socialism. I mean, it's not my preferred one.
No, I think they count. I don't like that they count, but I think they do count.
Yeah, no, I do too.
Yeah, it's. There are also kinds of Marxism, frankly, that I wish I could kick out, but have to admit that they are historically grounded in some Marxist ideas in a way that I can't just say, well, they don't count. I know that's a magic trick we like to do, but it doesn't. It's not really. It's a no Trotsman fallacy, frankly. So, I mean, and I'm sure most anarchists have a bunch of. I mean, there's a bunch of anarchists I'd like to kick out too, but you know. It's not useful to kick everyone out of your typology just because you don't like them. So, and I think that's an interesting, not just interesting. I think it's something we have to look at though, because in America, those traditions were stifled by a bunch of, I mean, like literally most of my actual scholarly work and stuff I do on the podcast is actually about how those became stifled or subsumed into progressivism and liberalism, and I don't actually count progressivism as a left-wing tendency. I've always counted it as a centrist tendency, and actually kind of rightist one, because there are some things historically in the progressive movement. There was a reason why there was a progressive movement on both the Republican and Democratic legislature, even at a time when those parties were not ideologically sorted.
Sure. I mean, a lot of this too comes down to how terms have evolved, and like, you know, we have social democrats up here. Right? We have the ideology of social democracy up here, which means that we have social democrats up there. And at least in the United States, I think that progressives can be that term could be, we could call them social democrats and it would be just as true. Now they might call themselves progressives for certain marketing reasons, because the word social anything in the United States has a negative connotation, right? Nobody who is a progressive in the Democratic Party who may be a social democrat is going to want to call themselves that, right? Like I consider Bernie to have been a social democrat, right? I mean, he calls himself a democratic socialist, but like all three of these, social democracy, Marxism, and anarchism, are forms of democratic socialism.
Right. What I would say with
or contain forms of democratic socialism.
What I would consider the issue with progressivism is in America, which actually gets to the confusion, is social democrats did become progressives. Stalinists even sometimes would call themselves progressives as a frontist tactic, actually. But there's also a separate historical strain that is tied up in there that is explicitly about like a certain class within the capitalist class, like a subclass of capitalists, maintaining power through using different social forces against each other to mitigate against, myths of laissez-faire capitalism. And FDR really is that person. And I would not call FDR a social democrat.
No. I mean, I would. In terms of policy, I think that, like, certainly not in terms of principle. Like, it was more about self-preservation of his class and their interests than anything that he implemented and supported the policies that he did, that most of which were executed. But right. I think that it would be fair to I would argue that the policies themselves, the platform, regardless of whether or not the man was actually, could be called a social democrat. And I agree with you that he very much was probably not. But that the policies and the platform were social democratic in that they led to reform capitalism that I don't think was a finished project. But in terms of, look, we moved a number that would be absolutely obscene today, and I don't have it off the top of my head anymore, although I wish I did. He moved something, I want to say it was like 40% of GDP to the public sector. that's social, hey, we're facing an economic crisis and you move 40-50% of GDP to the public sector. That is certainly social democratic in nature. What's missing from that, however, is there is that economic component resembling that has the characteristics of social democracy, but the social components obviously were not there, did not resemble social democracy.
And the use of Fordism and tying it up with later on, particularly after Henry Wallace loses, tying it up with private capital as a primary provider actually really did stifle even the development of an actual social democratic section of the Democrats in the 40s and 50s. I mean, it's not an insignificant move that these are also the same people that purged the CIO of all its communists and stuff that even social democrats probably would not have done.
Well, I would argue that was part of the compromise, right? It's like, if you're telling your class, well, this is what's going to happen, okay? But we're also simultaneously going to purge, look, it's us or those guys are the extremists. It's the commies inside the trade union. Right. We're going to support their expulsion, but you have to support this. And 50% of the business class went along with FDR on that. They said, okay, fine, we'll support reform capitalism if it means the expulsion or the diminishment of influence by the more radical elements in the country. And then 50% of the business sector didn't go with him and just remained staunchly opposed to the expansion of the public sector and moving.
They funded things like the Birchers.
Like the what?
The Birchers.
The Birch, yeah, absolutely, yeah. John Birch Society, yeah, exactly, right. And they focused on undermining unions and weakening unions and rolling back regulatory power of the federal government, undermining food, health, and safety measures that had been passed, and it was this constant struggle. And then they got their victory in the late 70s. They started to get it actually under Carter. And then by the time Reagan comes around, and you have Thatcherism all over the place, and the Chicago boys getting their shot in Chile, it was pretty much virtually the end of trying to use direct public, recognize that, hey, everything is already planned, and who is it that we're going to let reap the benefit of the realization of how money works. And so it was just a complete, they came up with the ideology almost to justify the class war,
right?
The
ideology came later.
yeah. So anyway, but ongoing project.
And here's the one thing I would say, though, as far as one thing we have to deal with when it comes to national conservatism, integralism, fascism, those kinds of reactionary movements, is that they are willing to use some of the language and even some of the reforms we associate with social democrats. And they tend to co-opt the socially right-wing elements of social democracy historically. Yes. So your comment that a lot of these a lot of these Democrats might become good Germans is that they often do. I mean, historically speaking, that's the class base for nationalist reaction is actually a very specific class base that you have to have a bunch of traitors from other groups to maintain, which is why Marxists underestimated its threat in the early 20th century, because they assumed that it was so unstable that it would just fail. And it does fail, but it can kill, hundreds of millions of people in the process.
Oh, absolutely. And that ties right back to where we started. MMT is just as effective and just as useful, and just because it's just as true under a fascist government as it is under a socialist one. So a fascist government could realize, oh, hey, full employment economy, great. Full employment economy, of course, for certain people. Hey, great, working class tax cuts. Hey, we have fiscal space for that. So with the realization of the insights that we went over at the beginning of this, they are just as true for our enemies as they are for those that we would prefer to see in power. And that's dangerous. Because if you have an honest demagogue, and Trump used this, he didn't use it because
he didn't actually govern with it, but he did use it.
He didn't govern with it because he has contempt for he has enough contempt for the poor that, he's not going to implement a full employment economy by way of a jobs guarantee. He's corrupt, so he still has business interests that he has to serve. But there's a lot of vested interest that is dishonest in Trump land. But if you get an honest demagogue, and by honest I don't mean truth telling, I mean uncorrupt, comes into power through the Republican Party, of course, and they say, hey, full federal jobs guarantee, let's do it, bingo. Okay, well, what is that reminiscent of? That's reminiscent of the politics of Mussolini and Hitler, but who's it for? Federal jobs guarantee for those who are not undesirables. And we'll put everybody else that we can in prison. We'll build the wall. Well, it turns out we can afford to build the wall. So we'll build the wall, expel the immigrants. We'll provide working class tax rates, tax cuts, but for the right people. We'll also provide capital class tax cuts because, capital is malleable. They will adjust to a fascist political orientation. That's capital is just, they'll be directed, But okay, FDR did that. He wasn't a fascist, but he also directed enterprise.
China does it.
China does it. So, I mean, public-private partnerships, you know, people don't understand. They're like, oh, that's, you know, like, no, like a huge chunk of our economy is reliant on the government's relationship with private enterprise in order to get the dollars into the economy. And that's actually something that, you know, I'll leave it to your audience to further think about. Is there's only two ways for the, you know, if the money is spent into existence by the legislature, there's only two ways to get it there. It's either the government's doing business with the private sector or it's a transfer payment. What's a transfer payment? Well, unemployment insurance, social security payment, some sort of direct payment from the government to a citizen under the government, right? That if it's a transfer payment, there's no exchange of goods or services. It's just a direct payment to the individual. It's a direct markup of the individual's account. So again, like Social Security is a perfect example of a transfer payment. Okay. Now, the only other way it can get to the economy for us to compete over is if the government is doing business with a private firm. Think about that. That's it. There's no other way. Okay. So, you know, an expansion of the public sector, then that public sector entity is still either doing business with a private firm or providing the service itself. So the Department of Transportation or whomever, benign public entity, when the money is legislated into existence for, okay, we're going to build bridges. Okay, who's going to build bridges? Well, the government's doing business with somebody to build bridges, okay? Or the government is building the bridge itself. In which case, the employees that it hires to build the bridge, they're still private sector actors. Because where are they spending the money? In the United States, if I work for the federal government's paying me, do I go to Uncle Sam's Inc., which is owned and operated by the United States government, to buy my toilet paper? No. I'm still like, I might be employed by the public sector, but the earnings that I make still count toward private sector earnings. They're still counted. Any demand that those payments create are still generated towards, I think I might be losing my spot. I don't know. But it's still money that's being spent in an economy that is part of the private sector. Now, what the Soviet Union did was they had eliminated the private sector, right? So that transfer of net assets between the government sector and a private sector didn't exist. Everybody is a public sector agent. Everybody is a member of the public sector. Any spending that is done is therefore done in the public sector. And so then this big argument between leftists about was this a degenerated worker state or state capitalism, I think becomes much clearer, is that it was obviously state capitalism. I'm not losing my spot. I still have my pod here.
All right. Well, we have been on for 3 hours, so
we have been on for 3 hours. I
would. You know, what's the interesting thing? So I've always loved about the state capitalist versus deformed worker state debate that I pointed out to someone and they got really mad. And I'm like, you know, from the definitions that most Trotskyists give me about this, you could technically have been both. Yeah. And I just walk away because I was like, if we accept self-exploitation as a given, and Trotskyists historically do, then you could have had a deformed worker state that effectively acted like a state capitalist. Now, in reality, I have come over to a thesis called non-mode thesis, which is there were attempts to do multiple modalities in the Soviet Union, and none of them actually worked or cohered, which is why, like for example, if you compare the USSR's form of state capitalism to contemporary CCP's form of state state-run enterprise, which some people get mad when I call it state capitalism, but I don't know what else it could possibly be, since it even has a business cycle like a capitalist economy. Is that the one run by the Chinese actually makes a lot more sense. Like it has less levels of weirdness in it, as far as like how many different currencies there are, how many different, like at one point you had 3 official and like 2 unofficial exchange rates for the fucking ruble. Like you had 3 rubles plus 2 black market rubles or something. Like it was absurd.
Yeah.
But yeah. I can see a certain Trotskyists get really mad. Normally, it's the Stalinists who get mad at me. I mean, excuse me, I shouldn't call them Stalinists. I don't like that word. Marxist Leninists who get mad at me.
Yeah.
So we'll see how that goes. But so yeah, I think the biggest takeaway is that the differences between MMT and Marxism and anarchism is actually is Marx in Capital, and I'm actually going to be specific here, accepts barter theory, and doesn't have Marx actually doesn't really have a theory of inflation.
Two things, right? So there's 2 contradictions between MMT. Okay, so there's no contradiction, there's no inherent contradiction between anything that Marx says and MMT, except on 2 points. That I know of. There might be more, but I don't think so. So tax liabilities being the cause of unemployment, Marx got that wrong. MMT demonstrates that to be the case. So unemployment exists because of tax liabilities. Without a tax liability, there's no unemployment. So that's 1. 2 is, the barter story or the barter myth of money. Marx got that one wrong as well. That is not what money is born of. So those 2 things, but otherwise there's nothing in MMT that contradicts Marxism, because that's not what MMT is tackling. There's nothing literally at all in MMT that contradicts anarchism.
Yeah. And on that note, we will end off. There's the great debates about small nations in MMT, and I'm just bringing it up to say we're not going to touch it, because it's literally something that we've been, not just Sam and I, but have been debated even amongst MMTers about how you deal with that.
Yes.
It's
a good thing for us to maybe visit on a future conversation. Yeah. How does one get monetarily how does one increase their monetary sovereignty without becoming a sweatshop for a more powerful, larger economy?
Right. That's a good question, and one that our historical antecedent is basically China, and that's it. So like I love when people talk about like laissez-faire capitalism and they talk about all the poverty gains, and even I'm like, well, since I do consider what Deng did to be capitalism, I will still have to attribute it to capitalism, but it's not capitalism like you mean it. And if I take China out of the poverty gains, most of the decreases in poverty gains is where we say it, but most of the decreases in world poverty go away like until like the last 10 years. So it's a pretty fascinating thing to point out to people when they're like, but capitalism is raising, things out in the developing world. And I'm like, by the developing world, do you mean China, now the center of capitalist production, or do you mean something else that I don't know about? Because once I take China out of that equation, those gains are minimal. But anyway, so we'll end on that topic. We'll come back to talk about international issues with MMT, Marxism, etc.
Eurozone. Yep.
Eurozone. Oh my God, the Eurozone. The Eurozone's about to get a lot more interesting again.
Yes.
So we'll deal with that another time. Thank you for coming on and giving me so much of your time. And we're going to end out on the chill space music because you're probably going to need to chill out given all the dire predictions that we made today. All right. Goodbye. Have a great day.
Thank you. Appreciate your time.